Good evening, everyone. Welcome to beautiful downtown Grand Forks. Thanks for everyone for coming out tonight. This is Grand Forks City Council's work session for Monday, January 1st, 2022. Under item 1, call to order. 1.1, welcome and roll call.
Weigel.
Here.
Dockler. Here. Weber. Mock. Here. Kamami.
Here.
Sandy.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you. Before we get on to our discussion items, I'd like to just let everybody know the format of our meeting tonight. Our city attorney is going to be briefing us on the multiple agreements and attachments that are available online for anyone that's interested in learning more about this project. There will be question and answer between the city council, the city attorney, potentially our engineering consultants, as well as even possibly some of the folks from economic development and Fufeng itself. As you can see on our current agenda, there are 3 citizen comments that came in earlier today that have been added into the record. Because this is a council work session, we don't typically do comments from the public. However, I'd be willing to entertain some questions this evening. I don't know if we will have all of the answers to those questions. So my thought process is we'll have anyone that has a new question that hasn't previously been asked will be welcome to come and ask a question. We will take down those questions for public response so that we can make sure that we get all of the correct information, because I don't know, there most likely will be questions that we won't necessarily have the answers to this evening. But I do want to make sure that we get your questions answered, and so we'll have a pad of paper up at the counter. If you'd, when the time comes, state your name and address for the record, we'll write it down, or you can write it down, and then we'll let you answer your question or ask your question. So, under item 2, discussion items, item 2.1, Fufeng Development Agreement discussion. Mr. Costa, good evening.
Good evening. Thank you, council members. I think what I want to do is I want to start with, hopefully that's up already, is the Gantt chart. I want to introduce that first because that's going to assist in our discussion of the development agreement as we go forward. What this represents is a schedule that was prepared by A2S, and Al Grasser went through it, and Sean Gaddy with A2S went through this and prepared this schedule of construction. I want to make sure everybody understands this is based upon
Mr. Gostad.
Yep.
Could you speak up? The people in the back are concerned that they can't hear you, or perhaps Mr. Bernstrom could turn up the volume on our speakers. Thank you.
Yep, you're not the first person. I speak lightly, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. What this Gantt chart represents is, again, a proposed schedule of construction of various components of the city infrastructure that is being requested to service the Fufeng facility. It is based upon a construction schedule that they've presented to us. There's all kinds of assumptions based upon that. One is, getting preliminary information we've asked for Fufeng, getting various permits and complying with other governmental requirements. There are assumptions as far as costs are concerned, and this is subject to change, but it's a good starting point so that when we get into the terms of the agreement, you'll understand the terms of the agreement a little better. You'll notice in one of the columns, it's the second column in, it says project type. And in there you'll see that there is a description called administrative costs. And then there are costs that are called planning as well. I have described those costs in the agreement, you'll see this later, as what I refer to as consulting costs. Now this is one of the changes that this is a older version. This has been updated, and it shows, for example, the program consulting shows about $650,000 in the version you got. That's increased to about $1.1 million. Just so you're understanding that this is for discussion purposes only. So I've described those items as being consulting costs. And you'll see on the second page of that document where it subtotals items up, where it says administrative and planning, it shows $905,000. That with the updating, it's 1.5 million. Also, in that same column, it describes infrastructure costs that are special assessments. Those are infrastructure costs that would be eligible or that could be specially assessed against the benefited property. And that's important because those expenses that can be specially assessed, by statute, special assessments take priority, lien priority over all other liens except for general property taxes. So those are costs generally that can be then assessed and recovered through property tax payments. There's one component, however, if you take a look at the second page where it says special assessments, the total amount is $17.8 million that you'll see on the second page. And you'll also notice in the column there's a breakdown of that $17.8 million, one of which is $503,000. And then there's the balance of $17.3 million. The distinction is important. The $503,000 are costs and expenses that would otherwise be eligible to be assessed, but would be incurred before the special assessment district is been created. So you can't then add those into the special assessment district. Those are costs that would be incurred that even though they would otherwise be eligible for special assessment, we can't do that yet because we won't be able to create the special assessment district at that point. The balance, the $17.3 million balance, would be subject to special assessment and then subject to payment.
Are you on page 2, did you say?
Yes. Yes.
That's not what's up here then, right?
If you scroll down, it is not.
I'll scroll down.
Because I only have
There you
page
go.
1 of 1, I don't have a page 2.
It should be on your screen now.
Is it available here?
In the grade area.
I only have page 1 of 1, I'm sorry.
I think when they printed it off, Mr. Bean, it prints into 2, but it's all one document, it's only one page.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, but I know he mentioned page 2.
I'm sorry, I'm looking at it in my document in the hard copy. It's at the bottom part, it's the grade area.
Okay.
Is where I'm referring. So the $503,000 are again costs that we can't specially assess but would be incurred. The other item that shows our trunk improvements and that's $77 million. Those are primarily the raw water and wastewater type of improvements. Of those total costs, that's the total cost for all of those infrastructure, wastewater improvements and raw water improvements. That includes the wastewater improvements that were already going to be proceeded with by the city. And so what we're trying to get down to is what the primary benefit as a result of FUFON coming in, kind of a but-for test. We wouldn't have constructed the raw water or the wastewater but for FUFON coming in. At the end of the day, what we're trying to do is manage that financial risk as well in that but-for, and the primary benefit when it gets down to the raw water and the wastewater, the raw water primary benefit is about $10.8 million out of that total trunk improvement cost. Of that amount, the city will be seeking to obtain cost share dollars from the State Water Commissioner. I think it's the Department of Water I think it's Department of Water. I can't remember, they changed the name the last session, but State Water Commission is what I recall it as. So that, the net amount is $4.3 million for the raw water improvements. There is also primary benefit wastewater that's included within that $77 million amount. That is at $11.3 million, of which there are sources either from the county ARPA funds that have been dedicated, which is $3 million, and then there's about $3.4 million of city ARPA funds that will be utilized to offset some of those primary benefit costs. So the net amount is $4.8 million. So as I was developing this agreement, the financial risk that I was trying to manage accounts for those consulting costs, accounts for those, what I've described as pre-special assessment costs at $503,000 amount. It accounts for the special assessments, those infrastructure costs that can be specially assessed, the $17.3 million, and the net primary benefit for FUFUNG, which is roughly about $9.4 million. Now, the delineation of the primary benefit was done by AE2S, and what I'd like to do at this point is to have Sean Gaddy come up and explain to you how he arrived at those primary benefit, because we started at the $77 million amount, and I want to make sure the council understands how we reconciled to get down to the about $21.2 million primary benefit amounts.
Mr. Gaddy, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thanks, Mr. Gosted. I just have a few slides to kind of break down some of the values that Mr. Gosted just walked through in these three primary areas, which is the trunk improvements, the assessment project improvements, and then those administrative and planning support project costs. You know, at a high level, there's a handful of ways that we're looking at offsetting all of these costs. Dan, or Mr. Gosted started to get into a few of those, but he mentioned the county ARPA funds. Primarily, we're looking at those being related to wastewater treatment. He mentioned it's probably approximately $6.4 million. You've got $3 million that was committed from the county for this project. There was $3.4 million that the city was also already intending to apply to wastewater plant improvements. There was additional approximately $3 million that was included to this year's budget that was offsetting cash fund and capital. So it's not all of those ARPA funds, it's a portion of those city ARPA funds that are being brought to the table to help offset some of these costs for the project. Mr. Gosted also mentioned State Water Commission cost share. That cost share is currently in application. In fact, we had a pre-meeting with the Water Commission last week where we reviewed that 60% request. And so that request is in progress. We will know for the preliminary planning and design cost portion of that, they approve it in two components, but for the preliminary planning and design portion of that cost, we will know that here in February. If that is approved, and typically if you're approved for that first part, it would stand to reason they'll approve you for the second part. They just don't want to overcommit themselves with those dollars up front. We are also talking within the agreement, and Mr. Gosted hasn't gotten to this, but there is an escrow that is being included. So for those dollars we can offset with outside sources, we are asking the project developers to upfront an escrow for those improvements, and that will be dependent upon where final costs ultimately land, but there is an initial deposit amount that we'll talk about in a moment that is being requested. Permit fees, primarily the permit fees would help to offset all that upfront administrative and planning cost that Dan was describing. And then, and I don't have the final calculation on that, but is Mr. Dave Slug here tonight? I think he could probably indicate that. That was $1.5 million in estimated upfront permit fees. The assessment revenue bonds, and then also looking at other revolving loan funds. So those last two items, you know, for anything that we don't have the outside cost share, and for those trunk improvements that would typically then be paid for through utility rates, both from the FUFUNG project as well as existing ratepayers, they would be ultimately paying off proceeds from loans or outside bonding that would be provided. This breaks down more of a tree structure to what Mr. Gosted was describing around the trunk improvements, the assessment district improvements, and the administrative and planning costs. If we look down or from the top, currently our total estimate for all of the city-related, I'll call them related, but not primary benefit improvements, is the $96.56 million. Following that down the left-hand side, Mr. Gosted mentioned the $77 million a couple times in his comments. Currently, as we look at the escrow amount that I described, we look at those cost share funds, we look at the ARPA funds, there's about $22 million that we're looking at in outside offsets, which would leave roughly $55 million left to be recouped through rates. Like I mentioned, those rates would also be a combination of rates charged to the project developers and the plant once it's up and operational, but it's also the rates that we talked about in the budget setting process earlier this year, or earlier last year, where the wastewater plant improvement project, for instance, we were already looking at over the next 6 years, roughly $50 million in improvements to the wastewater plant. So those rate considerations, along with new rate considerations from the project developers, would be how we'd be looking to offset that $55 million in trunk costs. As Mr. Gosted described, you have your standard assessment process that the city would look at the benefits of primarily the Fufeng plant site, as well as some consideration for surrounding properties on those utilities and local improvements that would be required to serve the plant, and then the administrative and planning costs, which we've mentioned a couple of times. As we look at the $55 million in the I'll call them trunk utility costs that are shown here on this graphic, we have initially contemplated within the development agreement how that cost recovery would look, and it's some in-depth language around how cost of service rates are set and how we would ultimately look to establish what we're calling initially, in a more simplified term, a hold harmless rate. So any cost that is incurred by the wastewater utility that would be above and beyond what we are already planning to charge the ratepayers would essentially become a part of the project's rate that they would pay for their initial rate period. So we're looking at really doing nothing here beyond what was originally contemplated within last year's budget when the 6-year CIP was presented from the wastewater treatment plant facility plan, in order to make up that difference and appropriately allocate the costs and those benefits to both the plant and the existing ratepayers within the city. This just breaks that down in a little bit more detail as far as those trunk improvements. The $22.1 million, again, the primary benefit improvements that we're looking to offset with those escrow funds, outside cost share, state cost share, et cetera, and then distribute those remainder benefits, like I mentioned, through the utility rate setting process. There is a couple of sections within the development agreement that get to this whole hold harmless rate setting concept, but essentially what this graphic is showing is if you have a certain set of costs that would make up what the ratepayers would have to pay water, wastewater rates without this plant in place, we'll be able to determine that, and then we'll be able to determine in the right-hand side how much the total cost of operating the utilities is expected to go up. That's both for operations, maintenance expense, as well as capital and debt service expense, and then set that rate for the Fufeng project related to that. And so essentially keeping that dashed blue line in the same spot for today's ratepayers, both and what they would pay today and into the future moving forward. That's the proposed approach within the agreement that we're looking at for the first 10 years of establishing rates for the project. And then thereafter, we would look at what we call more of a fully proportional cost of service, where we would take all of the cost, year 11 in essence, roll them in, and so for existing fixed expense, et cetera, for all the staff that operate the utilities, there'd be a proportion of that ultimately would then start being built into their rate over time, and then beyond that initial 10-year rate period. So looking initially to again, start up the project within the utilities, not impact the existing utility ratepayers, and then move into a more fully rolled in approach into the future after we've done that with the first initial period of rate setting. Mr. Gostin hit on these items, which are other key considerations. The pre-assessment district costs, the $500,000 that's estimated, that's as outlined in the Gantt chart. Those primary benefit trunk improvement costs, again, that we're looking to secure, it's about $15 million in trunk utilities estimated that we're looking at across the first year of development that we would look to secure through both a combination of letter of credit and that escrow deposit. The escrow deposit right now is currently estimated at $9.2 billion. And then there's what we call those pre-due diligence planning and administrative costs of $1.5 million. Secured by the letter of credit, should there be some default or a default, but also then paid for through those building permit and inspection fees. High level, that's really what we're looking at overall, related to the more detailed breakdown here of the overall cost loaded schedule that Mr. Gossett was walking through. And with that, I guess I'd open up to Council President Sandy, others of the committee here, if there are any questions for me.
Mr. Weber, do you have a question?
Slide 2. There we go. Slide 2, the $55 million remainder to be funded. You mentioned that was what was presented to us sometime in the last year, that regardless of this project, we were looking at those needed improvements, corrections, developments for our system. One of the hopes for a project like this is that it will benefit the taxpayers and utility users. Am I understanding correctly from slide 4 that benefit, we don't enjoy that benefit till after the first 10 years? Or help me to understand that orange hash section there better.
Correct, Councilmember Weber. What we're looking at is for the first 10 years, like I mentioned, not increasing anyone's rates over what we were originally planning for within the capital improvements plan that was presented last year. Year 11, what we would look to do then, similar to like on a tax increment basis, we would look to ultimately then roll them fully into all the utility costs, where then the ratepayers would start to see a benefit from having a very, very large utility customer like this within the mix of all other utility customer classes. So we would ultimately roll them in at that year 11, so all see the benefit of that. But year 1 through 10, ensuring no one sees any harm from serving this project at its initial development stage.
And that's going to include both our current corporate users and the general residential user. This is going to not affect them. It's not going to raise their rates. It's not going to lower their rates until that 10-year mark. And then we can anticipate some savings at that time.
Yep, well said.
Council President Sandy, I would say, when we speak, we're just speaking of, they're going to be a unique customer class because they're going to be a raw water supplier. So they're going to be a unique class. So we can't point to any other customer because they're the only entity they're going to, at least initially, going to be using raw water. So I think it's a unique case. And I think when they're rolled in on that rate, it's not going to be a significant increase on that because they're paying most of the full share to provide that. On the wastewater side, there may be some other costs that will get rolled in regarding the wastewater treatment plant and those sorts of things. But I think on the raw water, it's really is what it is, and on the wastewater, it'll be a little bit different. But there'll also be a waterworks customer because above and beyond just the raw water, they'll have potable and fire protection, water distribution that they'll pay their fair share up front. They'll have stormwater charges. They'll have other city charges on the utility side. And what Sean's going over right now are just on this raw water supply and the wastewater supply.
And the $96 million in infrastructure expense, essentially 77 of it is related to these issues, these water-related issues. The remaining 19 million will be discussed later this evening. Very good, thanks.
Mr. Veen, question?
Yeah, Todd, what's the process today? Is it, I mean, you've looked at things high level. Are we going to go through the development agreement and then we're going to go through all the different items so that we have a better understanding? Because I think, it's good to see this up front. I think we got to get into the details and then bring it back up to maybe what we see here because.
I agree. Council President said, I think it would be best that Dan now steps through the agreement and then we can come back to these items. So otherwise we'll get bogged down on some of these. I think what Dan's going to go, he's going to let you know where this information shows up in the development agreement. Really today is your first opportunity to step through the agreement. And really, if we asked you to do anything today, we'd just ask you to move it on to city council so that we can have a reiterative discussion at city council. So I think if the council's okay, I would just have Dan start stepping through the agreement, and then we'll come back for Q&A at the end when we tell the whole picture.
And if we could, I'd like, do you have a proposed timeline by which we're operating under? Because I'm not aware of what that is.
Council President Sandy and Council Member Vian, I think my internal time frame is that we would have a final development agreement concluded sometime in February, early March. So I really set aside the month of February to work through this agreement as part of the development agreement. I think that's the developer intends to start construction yet this spring and summer. And certainly, we have a lot of work to do with all the various state agencies to work on some of the particulars. So really, if we can work through this agreement through the month of February and finalize it, and then we're off to do a lot of work as part of what the development agreement will prescribe.
Todd, would you, for my purpose and everybody's, explain what a development agreement is and what it binds us to so that we know? I mean, is this it, the development agreement, and you're done? Are there other pieces to this whole process? Can we hear more about? So as much as I'm interested in the detail, I really want to know what this looks like, because for me, this is a significant decision. I don't want to be rushed. I want to be able to make informed decisions based on good data. I mean, that's the bottom line, so that we can explain it to anybody and everybody. So I just want to make sure we know what the process looks like, what the timing is going to be of that process, and if there's other things that we need to do and information we acquire.
Councilmember Veen, the question goes right into my next topic. If you'd allow me, I think it will get you, may not answer all your questions, but the framework as to why I wanted to introduce this first and some of the costs is because you'll understand the terms of the development agreement a little better by this introductory information. So if you'd allow me, this might be the perfect opportunity to spring into the development agreement and the terms of it. Before I do, I just want to make sure that the council is aware that we've been working on this development agreement for several months now. Back in October and November is when I really started to draft the agreement. I also want you to know that staff were instrumental in assisting me in the terms and conditions. Mr. Gaddy was instrumental in providing and assisting with the agreement as well. I also want to recognize the Fufeng representative, Mr. Schuterash, and their attorney, Mr. Ram. We've had discussions with them, very productive discussions, and what you have before you is an agreement that has gone through some iterations between the parties. It's not finalized yet. There are still some, I would expect that they may have some additional comments. I'm not expecting significant changes going forward. I think we've gotten through the most significant issues. But there may still be some additional changes that either council may ask for. Even Fufeng may ask for some changes, and that's normal in the process. But we thought at this point, we've gotten so far along in resolving most of the significant issues, this was an opportune time to introduce it to the council. The one thing that leads into Councilmember Veen's comment is, and I think I've said this before, is this is a springboard type of an agreement. I've listed a number of things that will spring from executing the development agreement. One is to prepare plans and specifications, not only for the Grand Forks plant, but for the city infrastructure. There'll be construction contracts that'll have to be executed as a result of this, that will contain general terms and conditions that we've outlined in the development agreement. Financing, special assessments and bonding will spring from this agreement. We've already introduced it a little bit. There'll be escrow agreements for deposits of funds to pay for that net primary benefit to Fufeng for both raw water and wastewater. That was a new development that occurred within the last week. I don't have the escrow agreement prepared yet, but the development agreement does contemplate an escrow agreement being executed. Annexation, plating, and rezoning will also arise from this particular development agreement. There will be a utility service contract that also is contemplated by this development agreement. It actually spelled out in the development agreement itself. And the pilot agreement, I don't intend to go through that in any great detail tonight. It's a pretty standard pilot agreement that you've seen in other, I can talk about it briefly, but that's another agreement. The other thing is that to be mindful of is that this agreement contains flexibility because changes can occur, changes in assumptions, changes in costs, changes in timeline. And so the agreement contemplates, both parties contemplate that there may need to be modifications as a result of changes that occur that are outside of anybody's control. With that, I will go through section by section, I'm not going to drill down in every particular provision, but I'm going to discuss what I believe are the most relevant provisions in each particular section. You'll notice in section 1, it's a definitional section. You'll also notice that there are a number of definitions. For example, it talks about the 27th Avenue North infrastructure. 27th Avenue North infrastructure assumptions.
Which document should we be looking at this point?
I'm on the development agreement document.
It's the document, 44 pages. That's attached.
And so the definition, we went through each and every infrastructure component and came up with those definitions for the infrastructure. That's describing what would be constructed. The plans, the actual plans that will be developed for that construction, and the assumptions that are made at this point to determine what needed to be constructed and to make estimates as far as costs. There is a definition called change in the assumptions. That's an important definition. It means that if there are a change in the assumptions that have been made up to this point, there may then be changes in not only the infrastructure that will be built, the plans, the costs, all of those things are incorporated within that particular definition. There is a definition called governmental authority and governmental requirements. And a governmental authority is basically any governmental body, foreign, domestic, that has jurisdiction over the developer, the city, the land, the operation of this Grand Forks plant. A governmental requirement is very broadly defined as well. It includes codes, statutes, policies, standards that a governmental authority, a government may have with respect to this particular project, the Grand Forks plant and our infrastructure. There's a definition called master development plans, and you'll see that peppered throughout the agreement. That's both the plans for the Fufang's plant itself and our city infrastructure plans. It means both. And then there's a definition called other development agreements, which is any agreement that's executed in connection with this document. The escrow agreements, for example, the pilot agreement, for example, would come within the definition of other development agreements. You'll also see that there are a number of exhibits that are referenced. They are not attached to this agreement because we're still working on refining some of those documents. The exhibits will define what the infrastructure is and what the assumptions are. And Todd, if you could help me out, I'll go through, these are, if you take a look at item D in the agenda, and I'll just go through so you can understand what each exhibit is based upon. Item D, this is exhibit 1.37 of the agreement. And and I think you've seen this already, this just shows where the Grand Forks plant is located. Next item is item E. This will become Exhibit 1.36 to the development agreement. It's the schematic of the Grand Forks plant. This will be changed, and we understand we'll be getting an updated depiction of this sometime this week. Next item is item F to the agenda. This will become Exhibit 1.58, or a basis for Exhibit 1.58. It just describes the raw water infrastructure that'll be built, some of the assumptions and costs. Next item is item G. This will be the basis for Exhibit 1.54, which describes the potable water infrastructure and the assumptions that were made for those infrastructure components. Item H will be the basis for Exhibit 1.67 to describe the wastewater infrastructure and the assumptions made for that component of the city infrastructure. Item I, this will become Exhibit 1.5 to the agreement. And this just explains the sanitary sewer infrastructure on 27th Avenue North. Item J is the basis for Exhibit 1.62 to describe the stormwater infrastructure and the assumptions that will be made for that infrastructure component. Item K is Exhibit 1.4 of the development agreement. And this just explains as the basis for the 27th Avenue North paving infrastructure and the assumptions made for that component. And the last item is item L. And this becomes Exhibit 1.7, which is the 30th and 33rd Avenue North infrastructure component. You'll notice that they describe that both 30th Avenue North and 33rd Avenue North could potentially provide access. As I understand today, Fufeng is looking only at 33rd Avenue North. And again, those exhibits we haven't gotten finalized to the point where I was prepared to provide them to you, but it gives you a sense as to what the exhibits will look like when they become a part of the agreement. Section 2 of the agreement, which starts on page 10, sets out the obligations of both parties. Essentially, if the conditions are satisfied under the agreement, the conditions in favor of the city and the conditions in favor of Fufeng, we will construct the city infrastructure and we'll plan it. They will plan and construct the Grand Forks plant, subject again to all the conditions in the agreement itself. Section 3, this again is the basis for the springboarding type of an agreement. For example, Section 3.1.4 talks about that this agreement is a framework for the parties. This section also talks about the parties working in good faith to negotiate the development plans. Those haven't been prepared yet, but working together in developing those plans. It again recognizes, Section 3.1.3 recognizes that changes can occur. If there's a change in the master development plans, or a change in the assumptions, or even a change in the law, if the law would happen to change in the interim, or if there is a change in the capacity, if Fufeng makes a change in their plant, that would then result in a change, recognition that the change in either the infrastructure gets changed or the utility rates. It contemplates that flexibility. Yes?
Can you ask questions as they go?
Well, I think Mr. Phelan had asked if we can wait until we get through this, but there's certainly, I don't have a problem if you want to ask a question now, Mr. Bean.
Yeah, I mean, part of it was the 80 days off. I was just basically gets back to 2.2 city infrastructure. Because it is the Grand Forks plan for the city infrastructure. If there's other infrastructure beyond what's described in here, like if there are impacts on Gateway Drive and other areas besides just Highway 81 North, how are those being addressed?
There is a condition for a traffic study to be done, and we'll get into the conditions. That's under section 8.1. And it also, there is also a condition for a public safety plan that deals with if we have to enlarge fire department. That's also a condition, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Some of the other requirements that I just want to make sure that the council is aware of, that the plans have to be engineered as required by governmental requirements. So there has to be an engineering stamp. The plans have to meet what I've described as usual and customary and good industry practice and meet all the governmental requirements. Also, the Grand Forks plant plans by Fufeng will be reviewed by our staff. And if it affects the city infrastructure, and we'll be working and trying to work through whatever issues we might have with respect to that review, but if it affects the city infrastructure, then the decision by the city would have to be incorporated within their plans. They might have to make a modification to their plan if it affects the infrastructure. Also, the review is meant to assure that those plans meet engineering, construction, and land development standards and governmental requirements. And if they don't, they have to be modified pursuant to the terms of section 3.2.3. In addition, part of section 3.2.3 requires that the developer provide us some preliminary information to assist in our development of the plans. I understand that they've already started to work on getting that information, and it's a host of information from traffic study information to wastewater information to raw water, the number of trucks they expect to have queued up on the road, things like that is being requested now as preliminary information. There is a section 3.2.5 that speaks to the parties. This has got to be a coordinated effort. The construction of their facility and the construction of the infrastructure. But to the extent that their facility or their construction interferes with the construction of the city infrastructure, ours would take priority if there is that potential interference. 3.2.6 sets out their scheduled milestones. These are not set yet, and it talks about that once the master development plans have been agreed upon, they'll establish this. But they've, as Mr. Phelan described, spring of 2022 is when they want to commence work, and they'll have substantial completion by April of 2024 under their proposed schedule at this point. The next section is 3.2.7, which describes the city infrastructure milestones. And that was that Gantt chart that we went over earlier tonight. That's the anticipated schedule, but again, there is enough flexibility in that section that if we don't get the preliminary information in a timely manner, we don't get those governmental requirements in a timely manner, this timeline would change. 3.2.8 requires that before any construction commences, that the property, the Grand Forks plant property would be annexed, that there would be plating done and rezoning for the property to allow for this to be constructed. There are general, as I spoke about, there are general requirements for the construction that we've outlined in the development agreement. For example, this is found at 3.2.9, that the construction has to comply with the plans and has to comply with governmental requirements. They have to obtain permits and pay for those permits, and that was the amount that Mr. Gaddy was speaking of earlier. That each party, the city and Fufeng, employ suitable contractors. That also in item H of that particular section, that we acquired necessary land rights to install our infrastructure. One item I want to point out is there's going to be a stormwater pond that'll be constructed on Fufeng's property. That is estimated to serve about 315 acres. of which, of that 315 acres, about 85 acres, or 27% of that area being served is outside of the Fufang property. So there's a storm pond that'll be built on their property, but servicing others. And the number of acres is about 27, or excuse me, about 27% of the total acres being served by the stormwater pond. And so what we've negotiated is we would pay them based upon that percentage and based upon their per acre price for the stormwater pond. We've been advised that their average per acre price is $26,000. And so we've come up with a math formula. If my math calculation is correct using this 15-acre size of the stormwater pond and the area that's being served by the stormwater pond, that results in about $105,000 payment to Fufang because we're using some of their land to service others for the stormwater pond. That would then become part of the special assessment.
Mr. Weber?
Quick, as we're going through here, 3.2.8 is about annexation, plating, and rezoning, largely putting the onus on the developer in this section here. Will we be discussing annexation in any other parts of the documents tonight?
No, that's the only part that it arises.
That's the only place that touches on that?
Yes.
Thanks.
I would say, Council President Sandy, I know we have citizens here, and some probably are in those adjacent areas that we're going to serve above and beyond Fufang, and we did have a earlier meeting with Faulkner Township, and some of the homework that we need to get done is we're working on not only on the assessments for the Fufang property, but also those adjacent properties, so that we can come back to future Faulkner Township meetings and other community meetings where we can show what those special assessments are estimated at. So that's some homework that we're working on currently, and I suspect there's people in the crowd here that would be interested in that. So we are working on that note, and with the complete understanding that people are going to be interested in that.
Thank you, Mr. Phelan. Thank you, President Sandy.
No problem. Mr. Veen, a question?
There's another provision that speaks to all contractors, whether they're doing work on the Fufang plant or our city infrastructure, have adequate insurance. Now, I'm assuming that all the contractors will have adequate insurance. My thought process in including that with respect to, for example, Fufang, is that if a contractor causes damage to either a city property or city employee, for example, that we know that they'd have adequate insurance to cover that type of damage. Also, this agreement does not equate to approval on any permitting. It's a provision that speaks that even though we have this agreement, that doesn't mean everything's been blessed and you can go forward. We still have to go through the permitting process that you'd otherwise go through. Some of the items that are in this requirements in the contract don't really apply to Fufang. For example, the competitive bidding requirement, that only applies to the city, not to a private individual. Also, indemnity, I can't expect a contractor on Fufang to indemnify the city necessarily, but a contractor that's doing work on infrastructure, you can expect that they provide some indemnity protection to the city for their work on city infrastructure. Section 4 discusses the various financing mechanisms for the infrastructure components. At section 4.2, that speaks to all the infrastructure being done on 27th Avenue North, and that's broken down into various components. There's the paving component. The agreement speaks to the fact that that will be assessed up to 20% of the cost. Associated stormwater costs along 27th Avenue will be specially assessed at that 20% of the cost. Sanitary sewer costs, infrastructure costs along 27th Avenue will be assessed at 100%. One item I wanted to point out is there is some additional work that needed to be done on Highway 81 in North Washington. That is not going to be specially assessed, and the city would seek some sort of cost share component from the Department of Transportation. Section 4.3 describes the financing for the 30th and 33rd Avenue infrastructure, which is primarily now going to be along 33rd Avenue. Those items will be especially assessed at 100% to those properties that are benefited by the project. Potable water, that'll also be specially assessed at 100%. That's at section 4.4. And then the stormwater pond speaks to the fact that it'll be assessed at least at an 80%, but not more than 90%. And all these special assessments, I believe, are consistent with city policy for other assessable projects. Section 4.6, this was a change that occurred, and I want to talk about the change that occurred just recently. Before we were contemplating the city bonding or entering into some long-term financing to pay for those primary benefit costs for both the raw water and the wastewater, the primary benefit component. In exchange for that, then we would require that Fufang have what's called a take or pay utility rate, that they'd have to pay a minimum amount that would be sufficient to service that debt over the long term, over a 30-year period of time. That changed within the last week. Fufang has now indicated that they would front all of those primary benefit costs, and that's where we deposit the money in the escrow account. And what I've described, it's their developers' raw water infrastructure. That's that $10.8 million primary benefit cost, less whatever cost share might come in from the State Water Commission. If the State Water Commission comes in at zero, for example, then that would be a change we'd have to take a look at. We might have to change the infrastructure. We might have to change what their obligation is. But under the current set of circumstances, what we know today and what we're expecting is that State Water Commission cost share will be at about 60%, or about $6.5 million. So the raw water, the net amount is $4.3 million. The agreement calls for Fufang to deposit that amount on the effective date of the agreement. The effective date is going to be either the date it's signed or very shortly thereafter. I expect it to be the date we sign this agreement. They would deposit that $4.3 million into an account. We'd have an escrow agreement, and this is the agreement that I haven't developed yet because this came up last week and I haven't had a chance to create that yet. That escrow agreement will talk about the deposits, where that money will be deposited, distributions from that escrow account. I would expect Fufang will want to audit those costs because they're spending the money. So we'll have to go through that accounting, and that'll be addressed through the escrow agreement. It's a similar change with the wastewater as well. Again, they will deposit into escrow accounts. So we'll have two escrow accounts, one for the raw water infrastructure, one for the wastewater infrastructure. And again, they will deposit, the way the agreement sets up right now is $4.8 million, which is the $11.3 million primary benefit amount, and deducting the ARPA funds that are coming both from the county and the city, resulting in a $4.8 million deposit. Section 5 speaks of the various utility rates that will be charged to Fufang. Again, if there are changes in the infrastructure, what needs to be done, utility rates may change. The one exception is that nothing changes with respect to your authority to set rates for other utilities that Fufang may use, with the exception of that initial 10-year period of time for the raw water and the wastewater component, where that incremental cost is being utilized. That'll be set for the next 10 years. Nothing under the agreement. The agreement says nothing changes with respect to the city's collection rights if they fail to pay. They're still subject to, like I said, all other utilities and all their other fees that the city may otherwise charge. There was a separate agreement with respect to the sewer connection fee. We're going to use the same city formula, except what we're going to do is we're going to take the amount of land that they actually have developed, and we're going to deduct from that calculation the amount of right-of-way or the amount of land for the stormwater pond. What it does is it reduces the potential sewer connection fee, but it's applied only to the property that they're actually using, not property that the city would have right away that they can't develop on, or the stormwater pond. And it's going to be implemented in 2 increments, because part of the property they're developing right now, the property they own, not all of it is going to be developed instantly. And so we've carved out what I've called the unused part. They eventually will develop on that, and once they develop on that part as well, another sewer connection fee would be charged, again, using the same calculation of how much land is actually being developed and deducting the right-of-way and other property the city may acquire. Section 5.3 and 5.4, again, talks about this initial 10-year rate for both raw water and wastewater. It's the incremental cost of service that Mr. Gaddy spoke about. There is an inflationary adjustment on an annual basis to that number, so it will change, I guess, based upon inflation. You'll see a provision in there, and I had to read it a couple of times to think, why would I put this in there? It says once the initial rate is determined, it can't go any lower. In case we go into a deflation period, we're not going any lower than the initial rate. That'll be set going forward. After the 10-year period of time, then Fufeng is going to be treated like every other industrial customer in the fully proportional analysis. We've also agreed that we'd meet with them on an annual basis and provide them a side-by-side comparison versus what they're paying for this each year during this incremental period compared to that fully proportional cost. So everybody can see what it's going to look like going forward, and they can anticipate what those costs are going to look like in year 11 and forward. There are some special provisions with respect to the wastewater. One, again, if they discharge wastewater that exceeds our surcharge levels, those surcharges will still apply. Also, they are required, and this is some of the information that I got actually from Mr. Gaddy. They have to, and the wastewater employees of the city, they have to adhere to our pretreatment program. They have to get an industrial water, wastewater permit. They are not to exceed our surcharge levels. We've also included levels as far as hydrogen sulfide, and they are to provide us a depiction and description of their pretreatment processes, and that has to be found acceptable to city employees as well. Those are special conditions with respect to the wastewater. Section 6 speaks to the pilot. I think we've talked about this once before, and you'll see this again during the public hearing. It's a standard pilot agreement. My memory serves me, it was 90% for the first 10 years and 75% the second 10 years. And it's the incremental amount that would get some benefit from property taxation. The land does not. The land continues to get taxed. I won't go through it any more than that because we'll go through it again at the public hearing, but it's a standard pilot agreement that you've seen that I've historically presented to the council. Section 7, this is the financial risk that we were trying to manage. First, there's a letter of credit. It's a letter of credit that'll be from a bank located in the United States, and it'll provide terms and conditions that are acceptable to the city attorney's office. We're working with Fufeng right now to get some of those terms that they've used in another circumstance where they provided a letter of credit. Section 7.2, and we'll talk about what the letter of credit will cover when we get to the termination and the default provisions. Section 7.2 speaks of pre-construction fees and costs. It divides it up between those consulting fees, that $1.5 million that we talked about earlier, and the $503,000 for the pre-special assessment costs. What Section 7.2 speaks of is that the city will cover those consulting fees, that $1.5 million. They can recover that through the permitting fees. However, those consulting fees are subject to recovery if the contract, if this development agreement is terminated or there's a default, and we'll speak about that in a bit. The $503,000 of pre-special assessment costs, if the project becomes substantially completed and they are selling saleable product, then Fufang will pay the equivalent percentage that they're being assessed for that same type of project for the costs that are specially assessed. So for example, for the 27th Avenue paving, for the sake of argument, assume that they were assessed 60% of those costs that were actually assessable. I've got $100,000 of those pre-special assessment costs that I can't include because they were incurred before the district was created. Fufang would pay 60% of those costs if they become, so they're equivalent. At the end of the day, they're paying the same percentage for each of those specially assessed costs. If they're not, if it does not become substantially completed, then the agreement calls for those costs being recovered, the entire $503,000 being recovered by the city from Fufang and the letter of credit. Conditions. Section 8. There are 8.1 lists a number of conditions before the city has to start construction. All the plans have to be approved. I'm not going to go through all of them. There's, I think, 21 of them. Governmental requirements have to be met. Permits, for example. There's a provision that says if the cost of the infrastructure, if they haven't increased by more than 150% from where we're at today, they haven't increased by 150%. That's a condition. Our engineers will provide us some opinion as to what the costs, what they anticipate the costs are today. And we'll look at it again, and that's a condition in favor of the city. So if those costs exceed 150%, we may not have to go through with the construction. We can waive those conditions, right? But it's a condition for our favor, in favor of the city, before we have to start construction. We've obtained, the developer has consented to the financing and the special assessments, essentially waived any issues with respect to the special assessments. The city has obtained all land rights to construct its city infrastructure as a condition. The developer has provided us the pretreatment processes that we talked about earlier, and they've been found to be acceptable. 8.1.15 is the traffic study. And from that traffic study, there is no material adverse impact on vehicular traffic and rail transportation needs and requirements of the city. That's a condition before we start construction. We also have a condition with respect to an odor study that there will be the study finds that there will be no materially significant noxious or offensive odors originating from the plant. And I think we've already started working with Black and Beach to set the parameters for that odor study. 8.1.20, there's a study received with respect to public safety, health, welfare, and security systems and measures, fire protection, things like that. And nothing would need to be altered because of the construction of the Grand Forks plant. That particular section says if there does need to be a change, then the parties will negotiate in good faith as to how to allocate those costs. Fufang also has a number of conditions before they have to start their construction of their plant. A number of the conditions mirror our conditions. One of which I want to point out is the $10 million natural gas allocation from the state that has been secured. There are some income tax breaks and sales tax breaks that you normally get I don't see those as being impediments. In fact, I think those are just wrote and given in this type of circumstance. I want to point out a couple of provisions, 8.3 and 9.4. Everybody wants to start the construction sooner than probably all these conditions can be satisfied. And so Fufeng has requested that the city waive conditions with respect to certain items of infrastructure that they'd like us to build in advance of all those conditions being satisfied, the conditions in our favor being satisfied. We don't have, I've asked them to provide us a listing of exactly what it is that they're asking us to build. That's going to be compared to what Fufeng would be building as well. So we're still waiting for that listing of particular infrastructure that they want us to start on before all the conditions have been satisfied. So that'll be a change that you'll see in the near future, and we'll have to discuss and negotiate with them as to what would be acceptable and what wouldn't be. We don't know that, and it's not unusual because there's 21 conditions, and with their construction schedule, there's some things that just would need to be done in advance of all of those conditions being satisfied, but we need to know what that listing is yet. We haven't got that yet. This is a fairly new development and something that we'll be working with Mr. Rahm and the Fufeng representatives to delineate and to be more precise on.
Mr. Gossett?
Yes.
Just for my benefit,
Yes.
because I'm anal this way, we go from 8.2.4 to 8.3.5. So there's an 8.2 and an 8.4, but there is no 8.3. There's an 8.3.5. So
That's
the
a misnumbering.
Right.
That'll be
okay.
another grammatical fat
Right,
fingers
okay.
on my part.
No problem, I just wanted to make sure I was.
I'm sorry.
No?
Yep.
Okay.
That should be 8.3, not 8.3.5. Thank you. The termination provision, that's at section 8.5. That's a termination by the city of the development agreement. And 9.4 is termination by Fufeng. So both sides can terminate the agreement if the conditions aren't satisfied, right? We have 21 conditions that we need to satisfy. They've got a number of conditions, and if a condition doesn't get satisfied and it's significant enough, both sides can decide to terminate the agreement. This is where I was trying to manage that financial risk, is that if there is a termination either by us, because a condition is satisfied, or by Fufeng, that we can recover those consulting costs, the $1.5 million, the pre-special assessment costs at $503,000, other infrastructure costs that may be built under the waiver provision that I just talked about, that aren't recoverable either through a special assessment or through that escrow account. So dollars that would be potentially at risk. Costs and expenses for drafting and reviewing the plans. Also costs for having to refund any cost share dollars, and specifically I've mentioned the county, the $3 million of the county ARPA funds. And then also any cost to remove access to particularly the raw water and wastewater facilities that would be constructed. All of those would be recovered through that letter of credit, that $5 million letter of credit. And if you add the numbers, I think the number gets to about $5 million total. And if those costs exceed the amount of the letter of credit, then the developer pays those excess. You'll see in the agreement also that with respect to those escrow funds for the raw water and the wastewater, I drafted the document that if construction started on either one of those components, the city keeps the money and we finish the job. Wei Fufeng, they've reviewed that, and again, I want to make sure you understand, this was a new development and this is something I drafted over the last several days and was presented to Fufeng in the last several days. They've come back and asked that if the money has not been expended, any part of the money has not been expended, they would like the return of that money. So mine is a little bit more, if I've done anything, we keep the money and we finish it. Fufeng has responded and said, we'd rather, if you've expended $1 million out of the 4.3, we'd like the $3.3 million back. And we wouldn't then finish that component of the infrastructure costs. I don't have any position one way or the other. That's a policy decision. One thing I would mention, though, is that if you're going to agree to something like that, we'd want to make sure that any contractor claims for not finishing that particular job, because we might enter in a contract to finish the entire job, and we want to make sure we've got covered if we return that money and they say, we're going to stop the work, contractor, you're done. I want to make sure that we've got enough funds to cover any contractor claims for that situation. Is that so that's still an issue that we need to work through with Fu Feng. And I have not spoken to their attorney about that component. I was told about this about a day or yesterday, in fact, about this. So, and all of this changed within the last week with respect to the escrow. The indemnity, section 10 of the agreement provides certain representations and warranties by the developer to the city. It also contains an indemnity clause that the developer will indemnify the city for any acts or omissions by them under the terms of this agreement. Section 11 is the default provision and the remedy provisions. In sum, if they fail to perform under the terms of this agreement or the other development agreements, if there's a representation made that proves to be incorrect in any material respect, those would be a default. There are other default provisions if they tip into bankruptcy, things like that. There is a 30-day notice requirement for any default. So even though they may have failed to perform under the terms of the agreement, we have to provide them a 30-day notice to allow them to cure that potential default. If that would happen to occur, the city has the right then to terminate the contract and also seek monetary amounts, again, to recover the $1.5 million consulting fees, the $503,000 of special assessment costs, all the city infrastructure costs that would be built under that waiver provision that aren't otherwise covered by a special assessment or by the escrow funds, the drafting of the plans, refunding of any cost share amounts, and fees to remove access to that, particularly the raw water and wastewater facilities. This would be recovered through, again, the letter of credit, and if it exceeds the amount, then the developer pays those additional amounts. And again, the same issue with respect to the escrow is with the default. Fu Feng, actually, it is not. If there's a default, the escrow funds, as I understand it, we'd retain those funds to finish the job if there is a default. Fu Feng has not asked for that money back under an event of default, just under termination. The remedies clause also says that it doesn't limit our ability to pursue special assessment recovery if we need to, or any other remedies under other contracts we have with Fu Feng. There is a limitation of damages for both parties, that neither party can seek, for example, punitive damages against the other, or consequential damages, lost profits, things like that. That takes care of the agreement. Section 12 is miscellaneous provisions, notice, where to send notice, things like that. One item I do want to point out, there is, with the natural gas, and I'm not smart enough to understand a decatherm, but as I understand it, the $10 million that has been dedicated by the state will get a pipe from Minnesota to North Dakota to service the Fu Feng plant. They can put in a 10-inch line at $9.5 million. There would be some remaining capacity even after Fu Feng's requirements for the natural gas component for that 10-inch pipe. So the state funds would cover that entire amount. As I understand, if they went to a 12-inch line, the cost would be to $10.5 million It would still meet all the requirements for Fufeng with respect to their facility, but the remaining capacity would grow exponentially from the 17 million decatherms under a 10-inch line to 55,000 decatherms under a 12-inch line. And so the issue is, if we went to a 12-inch line, who would cover that delta, that $500,000 amount? There's going to be a meeting this week with Fufeng and the One Oak representatives. We need some more information on exactly what the parameters are, but I wanted to bring that to the council's attention as well. With that, that ends my... Oh, I can give a quick summary of the pilot agreement. Sorry. Again, like I indicated before, the pilot agreement parrots what you've seen before. The tax pilot would not take effect until the property is substantially complete, so there will be some property taxation during the period of construction. The amount, and this was presented at the LAGAC meeting, and I think has been presented to others, that what we're doing is we're assuming that the total cost of the project will be estimated at $352 million. It's an estimate today. There is no building out there today, and so what you do is you take that $352 million value that's being added, and you'd multiply that times 90%, and that's the amount that would be taken off and would not be subject to tax. The remaining 10% would be subject to tax, and the city assessor would then apply the mill rate for each year on that 10% for the first 10 years. Similarly, in years 10 through 20, instead of the 90%, he would take it times 75%. That would enjoy the tax exemption. The other 25% would continue to be subject to tax, and it would be, we'd apply the mill rate for each year for 11 through 20, whatever that mill rate is, and he would certify that amount on an annual basis. Using those numbers, and again, the $25 million of land value continues to be estimated, continues to be subject to tax. It's just the buildings that enjoy the pilot. And based upon that schedule, it looks to me like the total amount of revenue for years 1 through 10 is, assuming those numbers stay constant, the mill rate stays constant, is about $928,000 annually total. And then it grows to $1.7 million in years 11 through 20, again, assuming no change in mill rate, no change in valuation. And then in year 21, when the property becomes fully taxed, the total tax is about $5.8 million per year, again, assuming no change. Like I said, the pilot doesn't become effective until they're substantially complete, and the pilot agreement also requires that they comply with the terms of the development agreement. So if there's a default under the development agreement, the pilot doesn't apply. If there's a default under the pilot agreement, we will terminate the pilot and the property becomes fully taxable at that point.
Thank you, Mr. Gosta. Mr. Phelan?
Council President, if I could just provide a few more highlights. We did go down to Blair, Nebraska, Fort Dodge, Iowa, and thank you for Councilmember Weber for joining the city administrative team. So we had a really great welcome in both communities. We met with mayors, we met with city administrators, we met with economic developers, we met with city council members, we met with water, wastewater folks. So we had a really terrific meeting. Just if I could summarize the two meetings: Blair, Nebraska, about 20 miles north of Omaha along the Missouri River. That's their water supply in that particular project. What you find in Blair, Nebraska is a Cargill agribusiness park. And so with Cargill is the centerpiece of that development with the wet corn mill, with around 7 complementary industries that surround that wet corn mill. Essentially, what Blair, Nebraska has done is they do have agreements, and they've shared all those agreements, and Mr. Gossett has those. But Cargill really is that center entity that's really running that agribusiness part from a water, wastewater agreement perspective. Blair, Nebraska has more of a hands-off approach on that. So the Fort Dodge, Iowa community is more like what we're trying to do here at the City of Grand Forks. Fort Dodge is supporting, again, a Cargill wet corn mill. Also on that site is a CJ Bio amino acid facility. And so that's a South Korean conglomerate. So, but they're right across the fence from one another. And so I think when you look at the Fort Dodge example, that's the most clearly close to Grand Forks. The city's highly involved in serving them from a water, wastewater, transportation perspective, have similar agreements that Mr. Gosted is going over with, have a similar interface with their state government, and that, in their case, Iowa, and how to move the project forward. So we had a really good meeting, terrific meeting with both communities, but I think if we're going to look at one community, Fort Dodge is probably more like Grand Forks. Fort Dodge, again, like a lot of industry, they've lost a lot of industry and so this is really replacing a lot of the industry that they've lost. So they, in their corporate park, I think it's going to look very similar to Grand Forks. They have an ethanol plant, they have an amino acid facility, and they have a wet corn mill. These industries are replacing livestock processing facilities that have gone away in our country, and that's what really made Fort Dodge what it is. So these are really replacing some of the infrastructure they had developed and are really replacing from a water, wastewater perspective. So the community is really embracing all of these entities as we move forward. I want to say both communities said these are really net benefits to both communities. They both spoke very highly of Cargill. They spoke highly of CJ, and they spoke highly of all these ancillary businesses that have grown up around. One of the really big outtakes from Fort Dodge is with the infrastructure piece, we got to have a lot of moves, especially on the wastewater side. You know, when Mr. Gosted went over and Mr. Gaddy went over these infrastructure numbers, if you look at $90 million, 60 plus million of that is wastewater. You know, from pump stations to force mains to collection systems to wastewater improvements. And on the wastewater treatment side, the community, we were going to invest, 40 to 50 million in that. But really what we heard on the water, wastewater side is, especially on the wastewater side, we really have to have moves so that we can adapt on any given day. And that's what we do currently. We already host industry in our community and do that. So we're just going to have to be really resilient, really robust in how we treat the wastewater. That's why it's really important for us to get all that information so that we can really dissect it with our team to make sure we're requiring the right kind of pre-treatment that we want on that particular site. The other thing we heard from Fort Dodge is once, we all want to start something and finish it, and just when are we ever going to be done? And how I like to say is a lot of times once you start something, you never really end. So what they said is once this wet corn mill comes in, there's going to be more and more investments in your community. There's going to be more and more demands because this industry is going to bring more and more investment to your community, and that's what they're seeing in both the example in Blair, Nebraska, that really Cargill is really the front, and in Fort Dodge, that's what they're seeing. And so don't presume in 3 years, you close the door, everything's fine. You're just going to get more and more investment. There's going to be more and more expansion in your community. And I think what we saw in both those communities, we see Grand Forks is a larger community. We're a more diverse community. We have many different institutional sectors, many different economic clusters in our community than they do. And we should be very fortunate for that in our community. But if you look at what Grand Forks and East Grand Forks, we have potato processing, we have ethanol plants, we have Philadelphia macaroni, we have American Crystal Sugar. We have similar industries on both sides of the river that we saw down there. And with this corn facility, it's just going to bring more of it. I forgot the North Dakota Mill and Elevator. So we have a lot of industries similar to them. Both communities said it was a really good move that we came and visited with the community members, and something they probably ought to have done, but they thought it was a really good move. And again, we're so appreciative of what they did. A lot of these communities have did eventually go to other Cargill communities and to see what they're doing. And they all said across the board, Cargill has been a really good corporate citizen. I would only anticipate Fufang with their first large investment in the United States are going to wanted to be a similar corporate citizen. Similar to what J.R. Simplot is, I would highly anticipate they'd want to do something similar in our community. Mr. Vian asked, this is, I was reading Mr. Kramer's, who's going to come up here and talk about Faulkner Township. We just heard about this in January, and I said we ought to have a meeting. And to be frank, this is really the first meeting the city council's had on this issue. So we've been working hard on a lot of these particulars, and we were just notified in October that we were the lead community to try to deliver this particular project, and we've been working on a lot of particulars in the meantime to get to this moment. So it's not that we haven't been wanting to include everybody, but it's because we've been working on the particulars to see if we can move this project forward. I'm really pleased to say that working with Fufang, we have an agreement with a few modifications that we both find acceptable. The other thing, we really need to start moving this project forward because we need to engage state agencies, because it's really the important piece of this. We've had some initial discussions with state agencies, but we need to start working through all the various state agencies. So when we talk about it's the North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality, we are working our way to various water and wastewater lists for state revolving loan funds. So we've done that. So we want to continue to do that. So we're looking to put all this infrastructure on both lists to try to get as best financing that we can. And some of the current financing through the infrastructure bill will even allow us to be able to take away some of those investments where it's forgivable loans too. So we're working really hard on both the water and wastewater side to give us the best deal possible. We're also working, as Mr. Goss has said, with the North Dakota Department of Water Resources, that eventually ends up with the North Dakota State Water Commission. Certainly the state of North Dakota wants to grow agribusiness in our state. That's, if you hear anything, whether it's the Thuraldson ethanol plant that's expanding, a lot of agribusiness is expanding in our state and in our country. And it just so happens in our case, we're getting an investment from a Chinese company in Fufang. But we're working on the raw water with that entity. We did get preliminary approval to move forward to the State Water Commission, and we certainly intend to get that 60% cost share, not only in the upfront engineering, but on the construction part. We're working with the North Dakota DOT, so the traffic study Mr. Vian asked about, we're going to look at all the traffic, whether it's 81, Gateway Drive, I-29, all the transportation infrastructure that we're going to touch that are state-owned and locally owned, we're gonna review as part of this to make sure that we really encompass it all. What did we see in Blair, Nebraska? And what did we see in Fort Dodge? We saw a lot of trucks, and we saw rail yards, but nothing that overwhelmed either community. And so we want to plan for something in a very similar vein. We're in a very strategic corridor with 81 and 29 and Highway 2 where we're situated. Bank of North Dakota. So the other thing we want to do is, right now we hold $15 million of Bank of North Dakota infrastructure loans. The state of North Dakota increased that amount to $40 million. So we have an additional $25 million that we can take out for low interest long-term financing. So we'll be discussing with the Bank of North Dakota. The Bank of North Dakota also set up a one-stop shop. So if we bring our project forward with all these public investments, they will work with us to try to find the best financing possible in all the different buckets. So we will have conversations with the Bank of North Dakota. Dan mentioned the North Dakota Department of Commerce, and really they're in charge of a lot of the state incentives. And again, the state is incentivizing agribusiness, and that's why we give tax breaks on the sales tax side on these, on the income tax side, because the state of North Dakota wants to grow our agribusiness sector. Finally, on the North Dakota Industrial Commission, we anticipate on this initial $10 million for the natural gas. There's a two-part RFP. There's bringing Bakken gas from western North Dakota to eastern North Dakota. That's going to take a few years. We were fortunate enough at the special session and with the help of the governor's office, that we have this eastern leg to get it to Grand Forks County so that we can move forward with the Fufang project. And so we anticipate in March that there'll be a resolution through the Industrial Commission where they'll determine, here's how we're going to move forward with this initial $10 million with the initial eastern leg to Grand Forks County to serve this industry and other industries in our community. I think we should be very pleased. A lot of the facilities that we went to, and the two we went to were natural gas fed, but there's other facilities that are corn is, or I should say coal is the feedstock. Here we have natural gas. We have a lot of it in North Dakota. We have a state that's finally going to move forward with a pipeline moving from to west to east, and that natural gas pipeline is going to bring more industry to our Highway 2 corridor and to Grand Forks. We are going to have, as Mr. Goss has said, we need to figure out what that additional capacity could mean for Grand Forks County and the city of Grand Forks. And once we get more particulars this week, we'll engage you from an economic development perspective if it makes sense for us to invest in a larger pipeline that can serve us with more natural gas over this longer time period. But we'll know more when we get there. We are currently working under many task orders. So you may ask, how did we get all this stuff in the agreement and how do we know what we know right now? Because administratively, we did move forward with some early out task orders, but we're going to need, as part of this development agreement, to invest further beyond what we can authorize administratively. And so currently, right now, we're working on the project management, development, support services, and a lot of that information was helpful to put into this particular agreement. We are working on wastewater treatment facility plan updates right now. And so there's a lot of work going on that, and we were already working in advance of that. I want to highlight one other thing is, we think with the Fufang project with J.R. Simplot and that really that magnet of the agribusiness area, that we're looking at alternative strategies from a treatment perspective on wastewater. And so we're going to look at some alternative strategies and maybe not invest everything at our wastewater treatment plant, but it might make some sense to build some treatment facilities in and around our agribusiness park and treat it where that wastewater is at. So we're going to look at some alternative strategies that would assess Red River Biorefinery, that would assess J.R. Simplot, and would assess Fufang and other new agribusiness industries in that area. So we're going to look at some opportunities, and those industries are aware. We well know Red River Biorefinery is at a struggle starting up. Part of their issue is the wastewater pretreatment, and so we really want to focus a lot of our energy on that and try to help themselves and support that. And I think our other prime industry is really J.R. Simplot, working with them and their entity. We're working on a lot of corridor utility right-of-way routing. You can only imagine there's going to be a lot of, we showed you some broad pictures, but there's going to be a lot of utility corridor work that we're doing. Initially, just try to work some of that. We did a lot of that last fall before the snow fell, so we could start working on some of those details. We're working on those particulars. And then, as Mr. Goss has said, we are working on a traffic study right now, trying to bring that back to you. What we anticipate is that we would continue to have this discussed, President Sandy at City Council. So if we had a work session today, you would just move it forward to a City Council meetings. And so every time we had a City Council meeting, this would always be on the table where we could further work the details. At a future Committee of the Whole and City Council meeting here in February, we need to bring agreements with you to further invest beyond what we've already done in all these various areas as part of that. So we want to get this development agreement in place because this means we really are at a serious point to work out the final details. And we've worked enough of the details to get it to you today, but there's a whole lot of more details that we need to work on, whether it's with the facility itself, with the adjacent property owners, and we need to get all those answers. And their goal is to get this project done, 2+ years from now. That's an aggressive schedule. And even if 2 becomes 3, we have a lot of work ahead of us. And the one thing I took away from Fort Dodge is don't think that after 3 years all the work's going to be done. And we really are going to transform the community and really deepen agribusiness in our community. And from what I saw of those other communities and what I know of Grand Forks, we can handle this project, but it's not going to be easy. And so we do take this with a very we're very sober about this issue, and we want to be really thoughtful, and that's why not only with the city team, I'm so impressed about their dedication and time they've taken to this, and want to take on more challenge. And we've also leveraged our regional and local consultants, and we've brought in Black and Veatch. And so when you look at some of this, we've engaged them on the health and safety. We've engaged them on what does wastewater effluent mean from a corn-related industry that we don't have in our community. What should we require of this industry to make sure that we make our community as successful as possible, and also help Fufang along the way about what they ought to do with their facility. So we're trying to augment and perfect as much as we can. But again, these industries are not zero risk. But thankfully, the people that came before us took some risks, created industry in our community, and look what we have now. And I think this is just a further step along the way, but a lot of details to work on. And with that, we hand it over to you, Mr. Sandy, for any questions.
Mr. Phelan, before you walk away, just for general edification, although it's stated tonight, I don't think it's 100% clear. All of the infrastructure costs, how are they being paid for? How are we paying for all the infrastructure?
Sure. We're number one, we're seeking cost shares through our own. We have dedicated ARPA funds. We did receive ARPA funds from county. Thank you, Grand Forks County Commission, seeing the benefit of this. We're going to seek state cost shares as part of these projects. And then once we kind of figure out what is our local balance, Fufang is going to pay for their fair share either through special assessments or through fees, whether they're building fees or whether they're utility fees. They're going to pay in a variety of different ways. I would say the one thing we did provide is this agreement, this 10-year, not all-in cost, but we provided them a 10-year incentive, and then year 11 they're going to be rolled in on those, just on the wastewater and on the raw water piece. So that's probably the one incentive we provided.
Right, but in general, Fufang is going to be paying their share of all the infrastructure costs and the lion's share of all the infrastructure costs, correct?
Absolutely. And we should always be mindful, because they remind us, is that they're investing a lot of money right now into design, into this natural gas pipeline. So they're already investing, I would suspect, tens of millions into this facility, getting it ready so that they can be in operation in 2+ years from now. And I think the other point, Mr. Sandy, is that we're treating them no differently than what if J.R. Simplot was going to come to town and want to expand and build a new facility. If Cargill were to come to town, if ADM were going to come to town, we would be aggressive and want to deliver a project to Grand Forks too. Because again, we competed nationally for this. We were awarded the project, and but there's a lot of work left to be done on this particular project.
Thank you, Mr. Phelan. I know ultimately I'm going to ask Mr. Veen what more he wants to learn. And I'm also interested in hearing from Mr. Weber on his trip down south, if he could provide some of that feedback. However, I'm going to ask Ms. Mock if she has any questions first.
Thank you, Mr. Sandy. I'll just throw out a couple questions, and then I'm sure others have questions as well. So any COVID dollars that the city is putting towards development and the county, that's all going to the wastewater infrastructure, is that correct?
Council Vice President Mock, it is specifically to the wastewater treatment plant. When the county commission motioned to set aside $3 million, they set aside contingent on this industry moving forward. So that's why that's at risk. If this project doesn't move forward, they did make it contingent on the Fufang wet corn mill moving forward.
And so in terms of, a community investment, it's going towards the wastewater needs that we would have. Some of them would be rather immediate. Some of them would be a more aggressive timeline if we have this development occur.
Council Vice President Mock and Council President Sandy, you are correct. Okay. If you recall, we had I'm going to say probably a 10-year time period. We were going to make these phased improvements. We're going to collapse those in 3 years. And the other thing, if you recall, we had kind of an asterisk part, which was that $7 million for if an industry came forward, we could augment our reactor tanks and put some additional treatment ability within those. That $7 million is really for an industry like Fufang to come in here that will allow us to be better able to treat within our 4 reactor tanks.
And so you had mentioned maybe looking at some treatment closer to agribusiness. Would that just be an alternative that would be studied?
Yep, Council President Standing, Council Vice President Mock, yeah. We're trying to find the best way to treat our wastewater long-term, and we got an immediate need right now with Fufang, but you know, when we look at our corporate partners in JR Simplot and Red River Biorefinery, sometimes we're just looking at one of the options is maybe we should build some treatment facilities near where industry is and treat it there, as opposed to having everything go out to our wastewater treatment plant where we then integrate it with all domestic commercial waste along with them. So we're just looking at the best long-term strategy with treating our wastewater.
So I assume, you know, that would become alternative analysis and we would move forward with whatever
Yes.
is the most either financially achievable or best
Yep.
for the water treatment. And one of, I think Mr. Gosted mentioned it as a condition, but one of those conditions, you know, I think we learned with some other industry that, you know, if their water treatment doesn't work out the way we had initially hoped and they had planned, it puts a burden on our system. You know, this is a exponentially larger project. What do we have in place in case their wastewater treatment wouldn't go as planned to just protect our facility?
Council President Sandy and Council Vice President Mock, that's a very good question. If you look at the other industry, and I'll call it Red River Biorefinery, we certainly had reviews of what they were planning to build. I think with this project, what we've done differently is that number one, we have an agreement with them. Number two, we're going to have a third-party review of their pretreatment system to verify what it's going to do. And so we're going to have more belts and suspenders on what it's going to be. Obviously, when we think about Red River Biorefinery, there's something like 500,000 gallons a day, and if you look at what Fufang is looking to deliver to us, it's 3 million gallons per day. So it's a much larger thing. So in many respects, we don't have the capacity like we had with Red River Biorefinery. Things aren't quite what we anticipated. So we certainly can have failure. We're going to have review capacity. We're going to be able to make sure that they've hired people that contractors that are going to work on this that are competent, because they're going to touch our infrastructure. So I think that is the important part of any part of their facility that's going to touch our public infrastructure. We get an opportunity to review not only their plans, from a development perspective, from a construction, and to further ensure that their contractors are able to build what is on the plan sheet.
If I could add, I think to that end, we've utilized, the city of Grand Forks has utilized Black and Veatch, and certainly AE2S is a national, if not international, engineering company that specializes in water, wastewater, these sorts of engineering concepts. So I think, at least from my perspective, I'm confident that the engineering teams that we have behind it are capable of answering these questions.
You know, I think there's still some questions in the public. Do we have a public engagement plan for, you know, outreach, fact sheets, getting questions and concerns that, because I think we want, you know, if this moves forward, I think we want the public engaged and happy about it as well.
Council President Standing, Council Vice President, we agree with you. And so as part of this, not only does the city on behalf of the community need to really get out there and do some public affairs and public relations, but also Fufang. But I think we're still at the point of, are we going to be able to consummate this development agreement? Certainly, when we consummate this development agreement, we need Fufang to sign it. It becomes a public investment, and I think then we're off and doing things. So we're still at the point of what's is it reality? And what we think in front of you, that we've done enough due diligence to get to a development agreement that we have reality and we should move forward to the next step with Fufang. And we'll certainly be engaging. Mr. Gott said we certainly need to engage Faulkner Township, and we'll continue to do that. There's a rural water system up there that we need to further engage. We'll have natural gas going in there. We have lots of community concerns. We'll have annexation and what that all entails and special assessments. Some entities that may not want to be brought into the city as part of us serving the larger area. And so we'll have a lot of the details to work out in advance if we move forward with this development agreement.
And then, I guess, kind of my last, so can you help me understand the timeline a little bit more and how that and our understanding of the impacts of it work together? Because I think, I'm a little, I understand needing to work through the details and then getting the development agreement. I'm still a little unsure because we don't fully understand the impacts in terms of, odor or emissions or to the transportation system. So what is the timeline like for understanding that and deciding if that's something that the community can handle? Or, the public engagement, certainly that's an important concept, but I think we need some of that before we can move forward with annexation. So what is the timeline like for that input process and understanding?
Council President Standing, Council Vice President Mock, I think when we talked about what's the at-risk, and really it's tied in large part to the air permit. So one of the major things that Fufang is going to have to deliver and execute is North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality air permit, Title V permit. I would anticipate Fufang's going to get an air permit just because there's a lot of air permits we have lots of industry, whether it's in eastern North Dakota or western North Dakota that have air permits. We have a sophisticated North Dakota Department of Environmental Quality that issues a lot of air permits, but they're going to have to go through that process. That could be a 6 to 12 month process. So we could be here this time next year, and that they have received their Title V air permit from the state of North Dakota. But in the meantime, we got to start moving forward with some of the early out infrastructure as part of this, in anticipation that Title V permit is going to be executed and delivered to Fufang. That's some of the things that are at risk. And what we're asking for with this development agreement, we're going to have to start investing in the details. And we're going to have to invest in money on that, in good faith, both sides working in good faith on the particulars. And that's going to be a several month process that we're going to invest. And that's why Mr. Goss said, looking at that letter of credit, Fufang is putting funds in an escrow account to demonstrate their good faith. And, that escrow account is a big deal to the city. It's a better deal to the city because instead of bonding out $9 million through over time, they're willing to put that money in a U.S. domiciled bank for us to draw from. So that shows the kind of good faith that Fufang has with moving forward with the project. So really this development agreement in all the different parts, it means that we're really off in working on all the particulars. We know Fufang is intending to give us more of the particulars that we've asked for on the treatment side and what they're going to deliver, and we're going to start working through all those particulars too with E2S and Black and Veatch and others. And we're going to be expending hundreds of thousands of dollars up front to make sure that this project is delivered appropriately. And that's why we have all these assurances in this agreement, to make sure we can work through the details together.
Thank you, Ms. Mock. Mr. Weber, would you be willing to provide your synopsis of your trip, and certainly if you have any other comments or questions?
Sure, and I'll do it in that order. Thanks. These are just some informal observations that I made personally while I was there. First of all, both communities were fantastically welcoming, gave generously of their time. I think we had mayor, city administrator, EDC, water treatment people, as well as others who came out. those were the only people who met with us. We didn't go to local coffee shops or anything like that, but we did get the official line. One of the things we noticed with both communities when we pulled up to the plants, the plumes were huge, but it was unusual weather for them. It was below zero in Iowa and Nebraska. They're not too used to that. And so the plumes were huge, but the plumes were all steam. They dissipated fairly quickly, and there was no smell, no sulfur smell we could smell at either plant. There was some disagreement in Blair, Nebraska about whether the plant smelled or not. The mayor, who was a bit of a character, he kind of thought that it had a little bit stronger smell, but most of the people told us that there wasn't a problem. The smell was coming from the lagoons, and so this is one of my questions. My understanding is that they had engineered open air lagoons and that ours would be covered lagoons. So if you want to address that quickly, I'll go on after that. Mr. Phelan.
Yeah, Councilmember Weber, that's a really good point. What we saw there were open air lagoons, and obviously we're further north up here, and so the construction on the pretreatment side and the waste, they'll all be covered units, and so we won't have that issue. Similar to J.R. Simplot has an anaerobic digester. That's the part of their pretreatment system near their facility that's covered. We would anticipate something similar to what we see there.
Truck traffic, 800 trucks a day, we were told. Now, in Blair, Nebraska, that was a real problem because all of those trucks rolled right through downtown. Our situation here would be very different for me because I don't live near the plant. People living near the plant are going to experience something differently, but that's one thing to be aware of. Additionally, they told us that there was upward pressure on pay and benefits as a result of the plants in both communities. There had been pressure on housing, especially during the construction period, and they largely addressed that by increasing their trailer park capacity. My understanding is our current vacancies at local hotels would be able to handle much of the workforce, the temporary workforce that would be during this 2-year period. But probably some additional trailer park capacity. While there's a lot of questions and concern about odor and odor pollution, one of the things we were cautioned about was light pollution. These are big plants that change the light situation. Although that can be mitigated by having downward lighting rather than lighting just up into the air, as was often done with earlier construction. But that's something that we should be aware of. Rail traffic, we were told, is going to be heavier than what's originally estimated. We're probably looking at a unit train, 2 unit trains a week is the current estimate, if I understand correctly. I don't know how much that'll be different from what I'm currently experiencing as a resident of the downtown area. The only changes to the town's identity was quality of life had been positive, is what we were told. So that was part of our question as well. In addition to all of that, we were assured that there would be more growth coming from this, as Mr. Phelan has already pointed out. And that expansion, that ongoing expansion, is both in relation to further industry coming to town, spin-off industry, but also the need for city staff. They're going to create additional needs on city bureaucracy. Mr. Phelan and I have discussed this, and Mr. Phelan feels confident that the additional revenue would more than offset that, but it's something that we need to be aware of. We're going to be seeing an increase in the size of city government to handle all of the additional industry. This is part of what they told us anyway. Those are the main observations that I took, and then I have some questions, if I may.
Note that this is why we send the professor for the great synopsis when he gets back. Thank you.
Okay.
Please continue, Mr. Webb.
Thanks. I'm happy to hear about the $4.3 million raw water deposit and the $4.8 million wastewater deposit. That makes negotiations, streamlines those. I think it's a smart business decision as well. But that $9.1 million, along with the letter of credit, that kind of creates the sum of our deposit on this. Is that one way for me to think about this?
That's, Councilmember Weber, that's a correct way to think about it. We were contemplating a much larger letter of credit when we were doing the, funding the raw water and wastewater. And with that being removed and really being secured up by the escrow, it allowed the letter of credit to go down to that $5 million number. But that letter of credit then also covers the consulting fees, those pre-assessment costs, the other costs for reviewing it, and the potential if we happen to have expended the $3 million of county ARPA funds to be able to tap into the letter of credit to reimburse the county on those dollars as well.
For myself, rather than giving that all up if either side terminates, I would prefer a negotiation that we get to hold on to all of that, but I don't need to interfere with the micromanaging the negotiations there. As far as the annual adjustments to the rates over that first 10-year period, is inflation the best way to gauge that? Inflation is a nationally based factor. It isn't really tied to local conditions. I don't have a better way of doing that, but I'm concerned if that's the best way.
It's a method to at least have a standard to apply what the increase is going to be. If there's another method, I'm certainly willing to listen, but it just seemed to be an inflationary based on, I can't remember the standard we're using, but we made specific reference to a particular federal inflationary reporting agency, and that's what we're using.
So not the CPI, but something more directly related to industry?
Yep.
If I could, what we normally use is the CPI inflationary factor based on our region for a city of our size. So that's what it's based on, not a national average, but for the Midwest.
Okay, so it does have more of a direct relevance locally. Okay, great. The hydrogen sulfide, I'm guessing this is part of the odor issue. You've kind of already touched on this, Mr. Phelan, about the covered lagoons. Is there anything more to say about that?
The other thing we've found, and both with speaking with Fufang and also with our consultant, is that there is steeping tanks as part of of wet milling, and so the concern is those are covered tanks. However, they're sulfuric acid and those things. So to make sure that those facilities are placed on the property away from property lines. So obviously that would be a concern. It should not mitigate beyond property boundaries, but as part of the site plan when we see it, I suspect Fufang's already going to have that as part of their site plan, just to make sure you put facilities that make sense, that may have some odor related to them.
Part of what I was told about the odor was some people were referring to opening up a box of cornflakes, and it kind of smells like that. Others suggested that there was a bit more of a fermented smell, but the promise is that it would be lower, that there would be less odor in our community.
There is. And certainly when we pulled up to the Fort Dodge facility and smelled the Cargill facility, I think I smelled heated up cornflakes is what I smelled. The 150% of infrastructure cap, I didn't really understand that, 8.1.6. Could you give me a quick summary on that?
Yeah, we're estimating X amount of dollars as far as infrastructure costs today. If we get into the project and those costs are greater by more than 150%, so there's a large increase in the cost, that is a condition that we can say we're not going to move forward with the construction of the infrastructure because the costs have grown so much. Doesn't mean that we would exercise that condition, but it is a condition in our favor.
Is 150 a good figure?
It was a discussion that we had in developing the agreement, and it was a number that seemed to be acceptable to those that were providing input to me.
To Mr. Sandy's, President Sandy's question earlier, my guess is, my understanding is that at some point there is going to be a portion of the city's share for the infrastructure that will have to bond. And the intention of the agreement and the negotiations is to make sure that that annual bond load, that debt is more than offset by this development. Is that the property tax that we were talking about already getting? Is that going to offset, or is there additional revenue, enterprise revenue that's going to offset the bond expense? Can you help me to understand that better?
Councilmember Weber, we will seek financing of the local cost share, whatever we can't get in, whether the grant funds come from state or our local funds. And so that increment that is tied will be through financing. We likely will use state financing instruments to do that, whether they're from the Bank of North Dakota or from drinking water or clean water SRF programs as we move forward. So there will be bond payments through those loan payments that we'll have to make. In all respects, Fufang is going to have pay fees based upon unit measurements, whether it's a per 1,000 unit measurement on the raw water or on the wastewater. So they're going to pay their share through fees as we move forward with these particular projects.
Okay.
I would say on the property tax side, when we go to the school board, right, they had hesitancy, and I think they're going to approve the Olive Ann project, right? Well, they're all about this project. Why? It's going to drive significant revenue on property tax, right, which they need. This is less of a driver for us on the property tax side, but it's a big win for the county. It's a big win for the school district because they're going to receive significant sums of money. We are going to have to really drive the project. We're certainly going to see some benefits on the property tax side. And when you think about property tax, what is that fund that would relate to this facility? That's street department, fire department, police department. So we can anticipate there's going to be some additional burdens on those essential infrastructure departments from a property tax perspective that we'll have to recognize. But when we look through this, and when we talk to, like, for example, fire department, the station that we have located strategically on Columbia Road, Fire Chief Lorenz says we can serve this particular industry just like we serve Simplot. So we're not going to have to add another station, more firefighters. There might be some incremental things we may need to do, additional equipment, some additional resources, but we don't anticipate having additional personnel, additional fire stations, additional police officers. There may be more demands on us, or maybe some additional training equipment that we need to know about. And that's why Grand Forks can handle facilities like this, because we already have a full-time police department, a full-time fire department, full-time PSAP, full-time street department. We can handle this from a basic infrastructure perspective.
Thanks. One more question and a final comment. In calculating how much the city will pay, how much Fufang will pay, it seemed that we are allowing the developer the benefit of those ARPA funds. That's not their money. That's our money. Why are we giving them the benefit of those ARPA funds that are coming in?
As I understand it, and as it's been explained to me, is that if Fufang didn't come and we expended the $3.4 million in the wastewater, that would provide benefit to the balance of the citizens of Grand Forks. We'd still be able to apply those, and there'd still be a benefit, even if they chose not to come So the $3.4 million of ARPA funds would then be allocable and provide a benefit to the rest of the citizens for the wastewater.
And I would just add on the county side, not that we couldn't go back to the county, but they explicitly said, we'll carve out 3 million for this project for wastewater treatment related. And certainly if it didn't come forward, we could certainly go back to the county and ask them, hey, would you mind if we still used your funds, but Fufang didn't come through? But right now, that was the contingent on that 3 million.
Okay. And then a final kind of comment. Whether this plant is developed in Grand Forks or not, I don't think it's going to change the price of a barrel of oil or the amount of production in the Bakken. If there is natural gas being produced in the state and it can be used in the state with the east-west connection, that seems like we're making the best of that situation. With that said, I'm hoping we'll negotiate hard for the larger gas pipe. And who would have access or be able to purchase that additional? We're going to have 3 times the capacity, 3 times the amount of natural gas coming. Who would have access to that?
Councilmember Weber, that's what we're going to ask. It seems like, theoretically, it's kind of a no-brainer to put in the bigger pipe. However, we don't know all the conditions. What we found is natural gas development and operation is different than, putting in a larger water main per se, right? Why you're there, put in a larger water main. So there's some nuance with natural gas supply and pricing and all those sorts of things. We're going to find out more this week, and then if you move this forward to council next week, we'll have additional information to share with you.
Thanks, President Sandy.
Thank you, Mr. Weber. Mr. Veen? Questions?
Thank you. Mr. Weber hit kind of the one thing that I was going to start with, which is the natural gas. A few years back, we lost in the winter natural gas, and we only had one source, right? So this will bring a secondary source for us, but possibly a cheaper source. And that minimal, I hate to say $1 million is minimal, but the return on that could be huge if we can at least get a 12-inch or whatever, because if you know the flow dynamics, going from a 10 to 12 is a lot more flow, as we've just talked about. So I think that's really critical, especially in the past we've talked about NPN. NPN wanted to come here, again, natural gas. I mean, the 2 big things that we find we need is water and natural gas. I have an issue with water, we'll talk about that soon, but the natural gas, this is an opportunity for us, so I hope we do whatever it takes to get that. If there's something for ARPA funds or something that could go into paying for something, I think that would be a natural. Does that make sense?
Yep, Council President Standing, Council Member, I think that's a big note. I remember when there was that explosion up in Manitoba with that, and being down in the Emergency Operating Center, this community was within minutes of being out of natural gas. And fortunately, Xcel Energy, working with their partners, were able to get that up and going, but it was a pretty scary time at that point. Why? We had no redundant line. And so we were solely dependent on that gas from Canada. The gas coming from Minnesota wasn't going to get here in time. And so I think this not only provides more price resilience, moving gas from Bakken to our communities, and provides alternatives, it also provides redundancy. So I totally concur with you, because there were some scary moments several years ago.
Okay. Todd, while you're up, a couple of things. We've talked a lot about risks tonight. Everything, there's a risk here, there's a risk that. I would really like to see us do a comprehensive risk assessment of the project and what all the mitigation terms are that are going to be necessary to try to reduce those. Be best to eliminate them, but whatever we do, I think a comprehensive risk assessment should be done in the whole project, and then looking at any potentially unintended consequences that may be coming. It's hard to anticipate those, but they do happen. So anyway, I would really recommend that we do that.
Yeah, Council, I think we'd add that into Black and Beach's scope, just to put some sort of metric together regarding, the risk, and we can put some sort of scorecard together. And I would only say, that was the value of going to these communities, because it's one thing kind of theoretically scoring them, but when you go to the communities and say they're there, they're operating. And so that was probably the positive of going to those communities, is that they were able to sustain it. And looking at Grand Forks, there's really no reason why we shouldn't be able to doing all of our due diligence, why we shouldn't be able to operate with a facility like this.
Yeah, so that'd be good. Some of my next questions will be pretty much infrastructure based, so we go through it. You've talked a little bit about the DOT and doing the study and all of that. You've done your due diligence looking at 33rd Avenue and North Washington 81. But obviously there's going to be a lot of trucks going down Gateway Drive, and we know that there's going to be unit trains that are going to impact. We know we have an issue right now on Gateway Drive where the rail crossing is right now that could mean a separated crossing or something an additional. So there are additional transportation impacts that are going to happen here, even as you look at the turning movements on North Washington and Gateway Drive. I'm concerned about the timing of the study compared to the timing they want a decision to be made, to not know how we will address those things again, if that is an unintended consequence that has to be addressed.
Yep. I think that's the important part, that we've already started the traffic study that will identify some of these things. So if truly, as part of the agreement, there's some real showstoppers that will shut down the community. Certainly, those are part of the agreement of we can't allow things.
I don't anticipate them to be showstoppers, but they need to be worked into the equation. That's all I'm saying, is how are we going to do that? I don't want to be, already we're looking at other major infrastructure. Some of those could be tens of millions of dollars. That's all I want to say, is because we just got to be aware of what those impacts are going to be, and I'm concerned with the timing for doing that. That would be real. Water is the other thing. I mentioned natural gas and water. Raw water availability is a huge issue we have here, and I think we can manage this if we can get a commitment for the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. We currently do not have a commitment from the state. We've been getting monies kind of piecemeal, but we do not have a state funding plan or a local, as in a LAWA funding plan. I would also like to see if we could, in the meantime, very soon, in the next month or less, start talking to the legislature, or whoever it is going to take to commit to having that infrastructure available for us. Because we're talking about a lot of raw water that's going to be needed for the plant, and we look at a 30-style drought, we have issues, right? So how can we, I want to see us use this as an opportunity to get some commitments for that kind of project.
Council Member Veen, I totally agree with that. I think we made a lot of movement on this natural gas in the legislature. The fact that now I think they understand we can build out our Bakken gas supply. It's going to bring more agribusiness. It's going to bring gas to communities like Rugby. But anytime gas goes somewhere, natural gas, water needs to follow it. So I think there was some enlightenment with that. If we're going to move forward with industry that needs natural gas, they're going to need also water and wastewater infrastructure.
Yeah, and I think you and I have been working on this long enough, we know that, but I'd like to see us start that discussions yesterday. Now, knowing this, knowing we've got natural gas, what are they going to do? Can we get a commitment? Yep. And we had 600 million legislative intent back in about 2013 or 15, I don't remember. Now it seems to be forgotten.
Yep.
So anyway, I think that has to be a part of this.
I'm more optimistic. I think with Minot and Fargo flood protection being out of the way, really the Red River Valley Water Supply is the next regional project that will get funding. And certainly the last session, we got through the flood protection project. So really this is the project that's in line. And if we tie it with natural gas, I'm really optimistic that the state's going to be able to move forward with the project.
Well, I've been optimistic before too, so I'm still concerned. I want to talk about the raw water intake. Why do we get water, our raw water comes from the Red Lake River and the Red River, right? We're going to pump that water to a point, and then we're going to have another lift pump station that's going to take it to the plant. There's a difference in price between the Red Lake River, and there's a difference in permitting between the Red Lake and the Red River. How do we do that if we're supplying I'm going to say expensive Red Lake River water and they want to have Red River water at this plant.
Council President, Standing Council Member Bean, the reason why we use the Red River permit, the Red River permit is the permit we have with the state of North Dakota. Primarily today, we use probably 90 to 95% of our waters from the Red Lake River. And so our average winter day is, we'll say 8 to 9 million gallons per day. We don't really touch much of our Red River permit, of which we're permitted under our primary permit up to 30 million gallons per day. And so, and plus we have additional industrial permits above and beyond that 30 million gallons per day. So really, from an industrial perspective, we want to use the North Dakota permit. We have plenty of permit available on the Red River. The Red River is also really important to talk about the Red River Valley Water Supply Project, because that'll be the conduit that will deliver the water from the Red River Valley Water Supply up the Red River. So that's why we're really maintaining the Red River as our permit to supply raw water to this particular. On the Red Lake side, we only have, we can draw on average 10 million gallons per day from the Red Lake River. So we're limited on that. We're not so limited on the Red River permit.
Yep, understand all of that, but the 10 million, I mean, when we've looked at water quality from the Red Lake River versus the Red Lake River has a better water quality typically for us. So when we treat our water, typically we take it out of the Red Lake River.
Yes.
And this would, and that's got a limited permit. So I see a conflict there about how we're going to do that. So one of my questions was, and then we're going to increase the capacity of our pumping station a lot, which means wear and tear. Is there the possibility they could have their own raw water intake, since they're further north, not that far from the dam, that they could do that versus us having to supply it?
I don't think within this time period, I would say. I mean, we're the ones with the raw water intake on the Red River. So I think within this time frame of us trying to serve them, I don't know of any other option other than the city of Grand Forks supplying that water, similar to with the Red River Valley Water Supply Project. We're the only ones with the intake on the Red and the Red Lake rivers.
Right.
And so I think we're the only option. I think if you want to talk about this, the biggest challenge, if you're going to have, is that we're used to treating Red Lake water, okay? Like I said, most days we can treat, it's 90 to 95%. Our raw water intake is gonna blend these two river systems. So we're gonna blend the Red River with the Red Lake River more than we have before. So from a treatment perspective, if you want to know the biggest concern I have, is that we're going to have to treat more Red River water through our water treatment plant as part of this. So if I'm worried about one thing, above and beyond a 1930s era drought, that's the biggest challenge we're going to have. And thankfully, we've built a really robust treatment plant from a membrane perspective and also from an augmented conventional side that we can do that. That's why we did all those pilot tests. But that's probably our most significant change that we're going to have on the treatment side. Probably will cost us some more, incrementally more in chemical costs to treat a higher blend of the Red River that we're moving forward. So I think if you want to know how is this impacting the city of Grand Forks, that's the biggest issue I would say.
Yeah, that's one of the ones that I think, I disagree with you on the water availability, because I certainly want to make sure we're following up on that. I have others, but I think maybe with what time it is, I'll just let it go for now. I think you've hit a number of those things. One of the questions I had, of course, was on fire department, fire equipment, fire availability. Will we actually, and when will we need another fire station? And what equipment might we need that we don't have now, and the training, for all of that. And I think as we talked about, there's incremental impacts to the whole city when you're doing something like this, especially in this location. I'm not saying that's right or wrong. It's just the fact that what it really is. So I think anyway, I think you've answered a lot of my other ones earlier.
Thank you. Mr. Kavami, questions?
Yeah, a couple of questions. And these might be pretty quick because you might have already handled these. First, I'd like to say that I'm all for economic development, and I think that, as is, this could be a huge benefit for our community. Couple questions are, we're doing a lot of studies and we're looking at a lot of impacts. Are we studying, and or if not, can we study residential and commercial property value impacts? And is that something that we're already doing? And if not, can we loop that in?
I think we've had some anecdotal discussions, but we can incorporate it as that, well, kind of a holistic study of the impact on the community, that we could add that in.
I think that some of the commercial property might increase in value, but I fear that some of the residential property, including people that I know, maybe that might not be the greatest thing for them. So I think if we can understand that and quantify that, I think it would be a lot better to understand rather than just going full steam ahead, knowing that we are impacting people's property values. Second question, and again, hopefully, or maybe we've already handled that, is have we been in communication with the Air Force Base or the Department of Defense just to make sure that they're comfortable and know what's happening and we're all in the loop?
Yep. Council President Sandy and Councilmember Kavami, there have been inquiries in that regard, and so there's been no finding of not moving forward with the project. So, but we've had some inquiries in that. We have followed up, but there's been no stop at this point.
And I'm assuming that we'd be able to have some consistent communication through all our other efforts with the Air Force Base.
We would. So we've had ongoing discussions with our Air Force Base and certain concerns, obviously. And certainly we all have to assume that we do have a national government.
Sure.
That is reviewing what's going on in our country. And certainly we responded to a Department of Commerce RFP for this facility. And so it's a widely known industry that's coming to our country and has landed in Grand Forks, North Dakota.
Sure. Thank you.
Anecdotally, I personally spoke with Colonel Curry about this, and he had no issues. Ms. Dockler, did you want to make a comment?
Actually, Kyle covered some of mine, particularly public, getting a study done there, particularly because I live on the north end and am privy to the wonderful smells every spring of Simplot and the coulee and the beets and anything else that you could possibly find on our end of town. And so I do think that's really important. And I know a lot of people here have been waiting quite a long time, very patiently, and so I would be interested in hearing the questions that they possibly had for us to follow up on, as President Sandy had mentioned earlier at the start of this meeting.
Thank you, Ms. Dockler. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Mr. Kramer from Faulkner Township to come forward and speak, but prior to that, we're interested in general feedback, yes. I'd like people's opinions on this, but tonight I think what's most important is we gather, if you have specific questions that you want to know the answers to, it would be better if we get those questions out tonight so that we can prepare for the next meeting where we'll all get to come back together and do this again. And in that situation, we can at least provide answers to some of your questions. And because we'll have a public hearing, everyone will be able to provide their opinions as well. And again, I'm certainly not trying to limit people's ability to provide their opinions, but I do want to make sure that we're able to answer questions. So if Mr. Kramer could come forward, please.
Thank you, Chairman Sandy. Committee members, city staff, thank you for accepting the written that I had also presented for you this evening. I represent Falconer Township. I am the chair of the supervisors. The township just north of the city, we start at the city limits and go north. We start at the river and go west to 55th. We're unfortunately only half a township because of the river that we have. And portion of our township, the original township, has already been sucked up by the city as they've expanded into our territory already. The things that concern us the most are that this has been going on for a while, of wooing the Fufang people. We just found out about it in November when it was presented that there was a project coming our way. In December, we found out that, guess what? It's going in our township. We had not been consulted. Nobody had asked for opinions. Nobody had asked for anything that how this was going to apply or affect the people in my township. We felt like we got blindsided, really and truly. Sitting in a meeting with Mr. Phelan and Mr. Lund, I said, hey guys, this is going in my township. Oh, well, I guess we better have a meeting. I think it's too late. We should have had a meeting a long time ago. So you've got a lot of concerned citizens here going, wait a minute, this is all seeming like it's a done deal, and we haven't had any input at all. And this is going in my township. And you're talking about taking over a portion of my township. Highway 81 North Corridor, 300 acres of farmland. All of this is tax-paying entities that support my township. How's that going to affect us? Yes, we're going to get some benefits out of a plant that comes into the Grand Forks region here, but we've got a lot of concerns too. We've heard some of them addressed this evening, but I've got some owners of businesses along North 81. What's going to happen to us? Can we afford to be within the city's arm? Are we going to get enough services to pay for the additional costs that it's going to cost us to be in there? Is Fufang going to be a good neighbor for us? What's the future development that they're talking about? I mean, the 300 acres, they're not going to develop it all at one time. What's the future development? I think those are fair questions to ask, and I think the public needs to know that. The city has a 2-mile zoning jurisdiction that they take out of my township. I have about half of my township that we have our own zoning on. The question is, okay, if you extend the city property limits out, are you extending the zoning beyond that, another 2 miles beyond your new city limits? That's concerning to the people who are out farther than the 2-mile zoning right now. What's the benefits for them, rather than just having the city's thumb telling us what to do with our properties and making us pay for permits that nobody comes out to witness? So there's a lot of unanswered questions, and we feel like we've been put upon. We really do. I mean, this is our land, this is our property that you're taking over. You want to take over a portion of my township, and we've had no say. This is the first time. This is why you see us. I know it's highly irregular at a working committee meeting, but we felt we had to stand up and be noticed. Okay? We would love to have some input. I know there's people behind me here that would like to see this whole thing go away. We had a township meeting a week ago, on Thursday the 27th. 63 of my township members showed up. To a T, 63 of them said, no, we don't want this plant in our township. It can go somewhere else. So here I am, standing up representing the people that I represent in my township, saying that, hey, you need to look at this. As far as we're concerned, we hope it's not a done deal. We hope that this is just the beginning of conversations between the township and the city. I'm open for any questions or comments. Any of us from the township would gladly sit down and talk with the council members or Mayor Buchansky.
Thank you, Mr. Kramer. Appreciate you coming tonight. I also appreciate Mr. Matichek's kind email that he sent earlier this couple days ago as well.
You know, we would like to be kept apprised of this. I know the first meeting we had in January the 7th, or snowstorm delayed meeting, that Todd had promised us quarterly meetings with the township. That's totally inadequate. We need more than that. We need to be in the mix of what's going on here with our properties, our property values, our tax structure. You can't call us out in the dark here. We need to be involved in this process too. Thank you, council members, for listening to me.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
I would say, Council President Sandy, that, you know, we did suggest at least quarterly meetings with Mr. Kramer in the township, and as needed more, so we really did extend ourselves, and as I said, We've also extended that we do need to do some work on the special assessments and what that may mean to property owners, so the next time we come back that we have specific numbers. We are working on those particular details. I would say at our initial meeting that we did have with the Faulkner Township, it was actually relatively positive. And generally, from the township, not all of them, but there was some positive that this is good economic development, not only for Grand Forks, but for the region and for our farmers. And so I didn't leave that meeting in January thinking it was negative. I took it as a constructive meeting, and that we're going to continue to engage with Faulkner Township and the various businesses that are in Faulkner Township.
Thank you, Mr. Phelan. Mr. Matichak, did you have something to add?
Yeah. Frank Matichak, 4150 Columbia Road North. I'm a supervisor at Faulkner Township as well. I don't know if Mr. Bernstrom can get a copy of this up. This is your city land use plan, okay? Future land use plan. I've worked on 3 or 4 of them through planning and zoning, okay? One of the things you guys keep bringing up an ag park. You want to show me where it is? Because we have industrial, we have commercial, we have mixed use, we have open space, public, but I don't see any agricultural park. You guys keep using that term. So till you get one, could you probably use something else like industrial park or whatever, because that's what it's going to be. It's going to be an industry. And I'd like to point out on the future land use map, everything in purple here is where industrial could go. The piece where this property is going, or where this factory is going to go, is still agricultural. And I guess I'd like to know what was in the process of picking this particular piece of property for this plant versus other pieces that are already industrial. Some of my other questions are, why do you need 360 acres? Most of these plants are on 40, 50, 60 acres, okay? And I think Mr. Galston answered one of my questions. I wanted to know how much the property cost and who was paying for it. And I believe he said you valued that $26,000 an acre for your wastewater pond? I believe you stated that this evening.
That was the number that was presented to me. Yep.
So in other words, that's what you're telling me, the property is worth $26,000 an acre for whoever's buying it?
I'm not suggesting that. I'm just saying that's what was represented as to the...
And then the second thing is, who is actually buying the property? City? The industry? There's a lot of money here on this property.
Yep. I assume it's industry, but...
Yep.
Well, those are some questions you could answer.
For the record, since there's a question, the private industry is going to, it's a private sale for the landowners. And so that's been negotiated.
It's a private sale, but who's paying for it?
I suspect you'd have to talk to the corporate entity along with the private property owners.
Because I think if there's tax dollars here, the taxpayers in Grand Forks need to know that. If they're buying land for this project.
Certainly.
Okay.
If the taxpayers of Grand Forks are paying for that land, they will need to know that. No doubt.
That's one of my questions that I have. And then I have a lot more questions, but I'm not going to ask them because it's getting late. But if this procedure is going to go through, I assume you're going to have to do a plat, a rezone, and an annexation hearing at both planning and zoning and city council, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So somebody asked the time schedule. What's the time schedule for planning and zoning? I know it's not in the February meeting. Are you thinking March, April? Because these people need to know. They need to come and be able to say what they want to say at those meetings. But you don't have a timeline on that?
I think our timeline is that March, April timeframe is what their intent is.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because there's no public hearing on the plat, but there will be a public hearing on the
annexation
on the rezoning.
That is correct.
You're going to rezone it industrial, right?
Mm-hmm. You are correct.
Okay, so there'll be a public hearing on the rezoning, and then there's also going to be a public hearing on the annexation.
Correct.
At both planning and zoning and city council.
And city council.
Okay.
2 public meetings at each.
Huh?
2 public meetings at each. 2 at city council, 2 at planning and zoning.
Right.
Correct.
Yes, yep. Okay. And I have more questions, but I'll ask them at a future time.
If you want to email them.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Matichak.
Just a quick question.
Certainly, Mr. Perkins.
Mr. Phelan, I shouldn't have to ask this, but you said something that confused me. I think you said that right now, we're just trying to finalize an agreement and get the city and Fufang to sign it, and then we can move forward with public hearings and other things. And I can't help but think that sounds a little bit backwards. Shouldn't we be having the public hearings before the city signs an agreement? What's the point of having a hearing if we've already agreed with something? And I think you probably have an answer for this, but I just want it clarified that when you guys get done finalizing an agreement, the city's not committed to this, right? We're going to have public hearings and some sort of environmental assessment and other review. So the agreement is just to have something we can talk about. Am I understanding this correctly?
That is correct. We have to have public meetings before the agreement can be signed, because the agreement has to be approved by the city council.
All right, I just want to get it on the record so we all know that.
What Mr. Phelan was talking, it's timing. He was talking about, we need to work out these details. Ms. Mock asked a very specific question about one specific thing, and you're applying it to the whole process.
Well, I just want to clarify.
Yeah, it's a very good question, and we should clarify.
And again, getting back to the schedule, President Sandy, as much as you guys could, if we could spell out when all these different steps are going to take place. I know you can't do it tonight, but as soon as you can, it would really reassure some of the people here in this room.
Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Those were good points. Yes, Mr.
Very good point. Thank you, Mr. Perkins. Really, what Fufang is going to, as early as this week, they're going to deliver us information on a lot of the preliminary questions that we've asked for on the various infrastructure types. We're going to integrate that into our schedule over this next year plus. And so hopefully even by as early as next week, Monday at our city council meeting, we'll have some updated Gantt charts on what we should expect moving out. And like I said, in near-term meetings, I also intend to bring back additional engineering agreements and study agreements to work on further of these details. And so certainly we want to be moving forward with a development agreement before I ask for additional investment to work on the particulars that are notated in this development agreement.
Didn't you just speak of them breaking ground this spring?
Thank you, Mr. Phelan. I'm sorry, I don't know who asked that question.
You spoke earlier of breaking ground
They are interested in breaking ground sometime this year. They want to break ground today, but they don't have the agreements there. They don't have the permits. So I think that, yes, ma'am, please come to the podium. State your name for the record, please.
Sheila Spicer, and I've been calling different areas. You're talking about the Red Lake River. I called the Minnesota DNR. They didn't even know about this plant. A lot of people do not know about this. Half of Grand Forks does not know what Fufang Group is. You need to get it out there. Boshinsky told me he was having meetings for everybody. The town would all be aware. I have called Canada. They're like, what's going on? Their wildlife program. I have called the air base. I got kind of an iffy thing. We're watching them, he said. I have called I can't even think of the name now, for controls, EPA. They have your biodiesel plant there, working on them because of the stuff there. If you've gone out there, and where do you live? Do you live on the south end?
I live by the Alaris Center.
Okay, go out by that biodiesel plant.
I've been on the north side.
I have driven down Washington, going through the university, and it stunk so bad I was sick to my stomach. And like I said, the EPA said...
Because of the biodiesel plant. They certainly have their issues, no question.
Well, what's going to happen here when these guys come in? You guys got them in and nobody knew about them neither, the biodiesel plant coming in. Nobody knew.
We had multiple public hearings. Multiple public hearings.
You need to say... What?
I want to get the word out to everyone. I don't know how.
That's what Boshinsky, I've talked to him quite a few times, and he said he is going to get it out there.
I believe he wants to as well. If you have ideas of how we can engage with people,
well, I think
we want to.
Our TV stations don't say much in our town. None of them say anything. It's you do not hear. I watch WDAZ. I watch all the rates at 6 o'clock at night. Nobody's saying anything. Put it on there. People will listen. People will hear it. And like I said, EPA they said they have no permits. We don't even know anything about this. So I called the EPA in North Dakota.
It's all about timing. It's all about timing and process. We're still trying to come, that's the whole purpose of this.
That's what I
was
wanted
to
to
get
know.
us to understand the development agreement, because once we get at least those terms together.
But do you not tell Canada what you're doing with the water? Crooks, the Red Lake did not know anything about
If the project's not going forward, there's no need to tell people that we're doing something.
You didn't tell us in the project.
Okay, I understand.
That's
Okay.
too much. You hide things, and we don't hear
Our
about it.
intention is not to hide things.
Well, good, then I'm just saying, I think people are mad. They're
I
mad.
believe you, and I'm sorry.
And
I
Bashinsky
don't-
and I had gone around and around and around about it.
Okay, well,
And the water, I asked him about the water. You know what he told me? A couple of years, it's not my problem.
well, that's interesting.
Yes, that's
I don't.
interesting.
Are there additional questions that you want us to add to the roll? Please come forward to the microphone and ask your question. State your name for the record, and we'll take your question. Yes, sir.
Dennis Cadillac.
Hello, Mr. Cadillac.
Are you people going to be honest and above board with this dealing? My land was taken for the dike. I was not treated that way, so I want to know how we're going to be treated this time around.
I would guess, Mr. Cadillac, we're not going to be able to satisfy you no matter what we do. I'm sorry. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do for you.
Resign, leave. You know, could you make an agreement with somebody other than communists? We're from Grand Forks, you backstab us, but the communists, you welcome, you bring them in, you buy them land in dinner.
Thank you, sir. Please come to the microphone. Yes, sir.
Hello, my name is Michael Coachman.
If you have a question and something new, that would be great.
It's actually, it's a statement that I think it's going to help with the decision-making, I believe, here. And when I came in here, I'm just going to it leads up to it. I served in the military 20 years. I love this flag. I love this book, the Constitution. And I love praying. And none of that was addressed tonight, especially when you're dealing with people, we the people, because this is what we are, we the people. I find that people at times change their direction with this, the Benjamin. And I think this is what it's all about. It's no longer about we the people, not the flag, not prayer, it's the Benjamin. And what I'm saying is, if you have done your research, no company that comes from China does not have military individuals in them. There's military people in the companies that leave China. They're in South Africa, they're in Africa, they're in Central America. And why I find that really important? Mike Pompeo, you gotta read his stuff, you gotta love the guy. And he talked about that to the governors in 2018 in a speech. He said, it's happened in your states with consequences of foreign powers and for citizens to reside in your state and affect their capability of performing America-wide national security. Think about that. You got a communist country, Dennis already mentioned that, in Grand Forks, down the street from a military installation. The country that country don't have any care about United States. But you're giving them more grants and more freedom than the people here. And I'm thinking, why don't you go 10 years without any taxes? That's what I would like to see.
Sir,
Pompeo said...
Sir, do you have a question?
No, I said I had a statement.
Okay, I know, but we're trying to collect questions. This isn't a public hearing.
I'm almost done here. What he also says Your new friend will introduce you to other individuals. Connection, power. In other words, if you got a governor who's in bed with the Chinese, they'll come down to the city, mayors, the council. He also said, they already know all about you. Why Grand Forks? They already did their homework on each and every one of you. Who can be brought with a Benjamin, or they got dirt on you. They know how to work the system. They've been doing it for years. He said, China happens to be inside the state and affect their capability of performing American vital national security functions. You know what that means if you're contributing with these companies that are Chinese-based? I believe it begins with the letter T. If you don't know what it is, that's treason, because you're working against our nation's security. He said this in 2018. And there's a reason for why he's saying that. No other people love American people like American people. I know that sounds kind of funny, but I can tell you right now, this company does not care about you, me, or anybody else. It's a military advantage for them. We got the technology with the schools, everything. They want to buy into it. And if you don't see that, you will. I'm saying that you need to. And as far as the Bank of North Dakota, let me tell you, they invested in over 36 Chinese companies right now.
Okay.
So I know their loan's going to get passed.
Thank you, sir.
Okay?
Appreciate your comments tonight.
You're welcome. If anybody else, if you're fed up with what you're dealing with, I will help you do a recall. Because they need to be recalled knowing this information. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'll take one more comment or question, and then we're going to call it a night.
I promise.
Yes, thank you. Questions are welcome.
I'm Jared Lundaby. I had a couple of just clarification questions. One of the things that was said about the wastewater was that there was $50 million in improvements that were needed, and what was on the board was $55 million. Is that a difference of $5 million, or are those put together?
Those are put together.
Okay, so 110 million.
No, that's
A difference of 5 million.
Yeah.
50 adding 5. Okay, thank you. The other one is regard to the taxes. I think you said 980 million for, or 980,000 for the first 10 years, 1.2 million for 11 to 20 years, and 5.4 million 20 years plus, roughly?
Per year.
Right.
Yeah.
So the 5.4, is that like the true what it actually costs every year? Roughly-ish?
The true and full value of the property.
Right. So is it correct to assume that the difference will not be collected for the first 20 years, or will it be offset somehow else?
It will not be collected. Only 10% will be collected over the first 10 years, and then years 11 through 20 will be 25%, and then in year 21, 100% will be collected.
Okay, so it's not offset by somebody else paying taxes in another way?
It isn't.
Okay.
I think what we're going to receive, obviously that $900,000 in year one is above and beyond what we already have.
Mm-hmm.
And so part of the analysis is without the industry moving forward, we wouldn't have almost $1 million per year coming into the community, even at 10%.
The other question, actually two more questions, so bear with me, I'm sorry. You went to the facilities in two places. Where were those facilities located as far as in town or out of town, edge of town, center of town? I know we said some traffic went right through town, but where were the facilities actually located?
In Blair, Nebraska, the plant was essentially right next to the town.
Mm-hmm.
In Fort Dodge, Iowa, I believe it was about 6 miles outside of town, 4 miles.
Yeah, I would say a few miles out of town, yep.
Okay. Was there ever any thought to maybe just calling a convenience store in Blair, Nebraska, or calling a shop in Fort Dodge and saying, what do you guys think of these places, as opposed to just, I mean, I understand you can only meet with a certain amount of people, but I mean, we got phone numbers we can call and say, what do you guys think of this plant? How does it affect your city? What's the general sentiment of the people? And maybe get a little bit more input than the top end.
It's a great idea. We were gone 2.5 days. We drove the whole time. So getting from place to place and back in town, we only had limited time.
Understood.
But we had a great turnout from the community. But yeah, any of us could contact people in those communities and ask them those questions. Although there were folks, not just from city government, the economic development people were there, and so that we tried to get a broad-based response. Yeah.
Thank you. And I have no statement.
Thank you.
By the way, folks, I am not suicidal. Don't abstain me.
So,
Hello, President.
we'll take one additional question tonight.
This is from the agricultural sector.
Okay.
President, Council President Sandy, Councilman. A lot's been said about this just in this room. We want to do something for our farmers. This isn't going to do anything for farmers. We're basically based on whether or not we can get a better price for our commodities, and this is not going to provide that. We're bringing in 2 unit trains a week. That's 100 roughly a year. That's coming from somewhere else. I've been the past president of Grand Forks County Farmers Union. I'm a member of the Thompson Farmers Co-op Elevator, the Amarillo Farmers Co-op Elevator, served on the board and was secretary of the Amarillo Farmers Co-op Elevator. And the Farmers Union believes in the cooperative movement, and that's why we have cooperative elevators throughout the state. We've built the agricultural basis in this state, which is the basis of the economy. It's what brought the state to what it is, using the resources that the state provides. And this is not going to help our price, because if it's not going to bump the basis up. Even if it does bump it up 5-10 cents, as the corn grower said, that isn't worth the trucking. The things that haven't been really discussed is what's going to be the effect of this facility on the local co-op elevators. A lot of the farmers are members of co-op elevators, some are not. That is what provides most of the grain transfer in this state. And so if you bring this in, and there's going to be 300 trucks going a day into it, or whatever it may be, that's trucks that don't go necessarily to the co-op elevators. I mean, there's going to be a lot of loyal farmers who are going to patronize their elevators, but that is going to bypass the local co-op elevators into this. There's a lot of rhetoric. Keep on talking about what we're going to do for the farmers. This is not going to help us. And the issue is that there's going to be $106 million that I see from the presentation of subsidies to this particular grain buyer. That is not something that is afforded to the Thompson elevator, the Honeyford elevator, the Emery elevator, the Manville elevator, and expanding out beyond. So there's often been said in the past, what about a level playing field? This doesn't seem very level to me. It seems very much slanted in the favor of Fufeng. So that's got to be a question that's got to be taken into consideration too. What's going to be the effect on the local economy? Yeah, other outfits have the right to come in and buy corn, but I don't see anybody else getting the subsidies like this. So is it proper for the city, the county, the state to be providing $106 million to one particular corn buyer over all the other elevators and other corn buyers in the region?
Good question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Okay. Mr. Gosted, thank you for providing all that information tonight. Mr. Phelan, I really appreciate it. I think it was mentioned earlier today, this is our first discussion about this project, so we're certainly all starting to do our due diligence. I don't think any one of us came into this with all of the answers, certainly with lots of questions. So we're doing our due diligence the way we expect all the people in Faulkner Township and elsewhere within our community to want to do so. We'll take your last questions. Yes, sir.
Mr. Sandy, appreciate it. Thank you, council members. Like you said, there's a lot of information to take in, but there's a lot of people that need to take that information in. So I hope the one thing we've agreed on is to have an open forum set up, so anybody that wants to put their time and effort into their opinion would be more than welcome. The question that I do have, because you want to question, is do you know what process you're going to take to bring the Faulkner Township people into the city limits? Is it going to be forced annexation? Is it going to be eminent domain? Or what is the process that gives you the right to tell us that we belong to you? Because I know there's been communities south of Fargo that Fargo has been trying to bring in for some time. And Grand Forks has been trying to bring us into the city limits. There's no doubt about it. They've been trying to bring us into the city limits for a long time. There's pros and cons to that. Guess what? I'll listen to an argument. And when it's all said and done, my feeling is that if you put this out for a vote, I mean, there's a lot of pressure on you guys to make this determination. You know, he's a salesman. He's done a great job. You know, let's sit back and listen to Todd. You want to know something? He's got good points, but I never heard him say anything negative about it. If he wants to be an honest guy, let's hear the whole story. The next thing is there any way possible that we take the burden off of the council and let's have a vote, a citywide vote in Grand Forks? That's all I got to say.
Thank you. Thank you very much for all the comments and questions. We will be discussing this topic at the city council meeting, or are we going to committee of the whole in 2 weeks?
Council President Sandy, would the city council mind moving it to the next city council meeting?
So a week from today.
Week from today, if we could just have a motion to move it forward and we put it on council, we'd have additional information, further briefings.
Answers to many of these questions.
Answers to those questions, and then it would just allow you to keep moving it from your one meeting to the next.
Is there
I'll make that motion.
Moved by Weber. Is there a second? By Kavami. Any other comments or questions? Mr. Veen?
Todd, just so we got clarity on that, if we didn't bring it to the next council, we would end up be 2 weeks further down the road before you go to council?
Yeah, you would end up back at the committee of the whole, so I'm just asking to move it to city council, because then it's within your jurisdiction to have the discussion you want, and then to create special meetings. It gets you to a motion meeting.
Can you, between now and then, have the communication plan that we've talked about, or that we could talk about what the process is? Because I started out that in the very beginning. How is this thing going to move? When would decisions have to be made? And I'm not only the ones that would get through the development agreement, you know, some of that I've asked about with a transportation plan and all of that. I think I'd like to see how all that fits together.
Yes, and we're going to get more information this week, and then we can further advise you. That's why I'm asking to move it to city council.
And if I may ask a question before I vote on my own motion, bringing this forward next week, that's just for further discussion?
Yes, absolutely. I'm asking you to move it forward for further discussion.
And everyone who's here tonight is welcome in a week.
A week from tonight, public hearing. Everyone's welcome to come forward and provide their opinions. And
that was the understanding of my motion. I'm ready to vote.
It's not a public hearing.
It would be a public hearing at the council meeting. Well, I guess it depends on what's actually put on the agenda.
It'll be
there is public comment at every council meeting.
That's why if you put it to city council, you have that public citizen comment period. Right. And embedded, I just want to say one more time, embedded in the development agreement, there's plenty of initiatives we need to move forward with that will require city council final action and public hearings.
Each individually. And so multiple of them will need public hearings. So there's a motion and a second. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. Motion carries unanimously. Is there a motion to adjourn? By Dockler, a second by Weber. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, same sign. We're adjourned. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for coming tonight.